Welcome to HP FanFiction. Support me by subscribing the channel. Also, like and share the video to keep me motivated to make more videos like these. Where she was sitting, Daphne had been making careful notes. When she was ready, she drew everyone's attention. All right, the contract, idiocy that it is, does not specifically state that the person whose name appears on the slip is the one who must submit it into the goblet, and the name written on the slip is in Harry's handwriting, even if the name of the school is not. Therefore, he wrote his name on a slip of parchment, and someone else then dropped it into the goblet. They, whoever they are, did not negate that by writing the name of a school directly below his name and hiding it. So he's bound. The contract does not state that only those of age could compete. However, the contract does state that if he breaks the rules, he breaches the contract. Hold it a second, said Hermione, from where she was frowning and flicking through the rules. And the rules state someone cannot compete if they're not of age. If he doesn't compete, he supposedly breaks the contract. And according to what Daphne just read, if he does compete, he breaks the rules, which is a breach of contract. By the ways these are written, he's damned if he does and damned if he doesn't. Harry sighed and said, "For now then, see what the contract and rules state I have to do, other than compete in the tasks, please. I'm going to go and work off some nervous energy with the target dummies." The group worked for a couple of hours through the contracts and rules, looking for anything that could help, when Harry's mirror vibrated and warmed again. Standing up and stepping away from the others, Harry answered the mirror. "Here, Sirius," said Harry. "What have you found?" "A damned good lawyer, for one, Harry," the old dog said, pleased with himself. "I'm currently at Greengrass Estate and we're waiting on him, your Aunt Amelia, and your Gran to join us. Then we're coming en masse. Can you let me know when you arrive at the gates so I can meet you in the entrance hall?" asked Harry. "We're all up on the 7th floor at the moment." "Can do, pup," said the dog father. "I'll contact you again then, all right?" With a nod, Harry replied, "All right, bye," and he shut the connection down. "It looks like the cavalry are getting things ready," said Harry. "They'll be here soon." Looking over at those reading the contract and rules, he asked, "Anyone find anything else even remotely interesting?" "Well, we know you have to compete, and we know there's no definition for what compete means, either. However, that's all you're required to do," said Daphne. "So not going into that room off the Great Hall was not something you were required to do," said Hermione. Harry nodded. "How about media obligations? Anything there?" "Nothing," said Daphne. "So you're clear to sell yourself to Luna," she smirked. Harry just snorted. "So I'm clear to have this contract lawyer draw up a contract for my media rights to be sold for 3 nuts to Luna. Then, Father is going to love it when he hears this," she smiled. "You know what he's going to say, don't you?" "That it was a very Slytherin thing to do," laughed Harry. After packing up all their work they'd been doing, Harry's mirror warmed and vibrated just as they had finished. A quick acknowledgement to Sirius, and they trooped downstairs, arriving in the entrance hall as the adults walked in through the main doors. Quick hugs and other greetings later, and Harry and the 7 were being introduced to a tall, thin man with greying hair by Cygnus. "Harry, this is Dewey Screwhim, barrister and solicitor. He's here for you as your legal counsel," said Cygnus. The tall man stepped forward and offered his hand, which Harry accepted. "Good morning, Mr. Potter." When Screwhim stepped back, he asked, "Is there anywhere private we may go?" "Yes, sir," replied Harry with a smile. "3rd floor. We have a room there we can use." The entire group walked in relative silence up to the 3rd floor, and after Daphne opened the etiquette club rooms, led everyone inside.
"Wow,
"Harry, this place looks even better than your letters described it to be," said Sirius, looking around. "Thank you," Harry smiled back. Mr. Screwhim withdrew his wand and conjured a large conference table in the middle of the floor inside the U of tables. Then he conjured up quite a few office-style chairs at the table. Finally, he cast a privacy shield around the lot. "Please take seat, everyone," he said, gesturing to the table. Walking forward, he placed his small legal satchel on the table and placed his thumb on a magical signature lock, holding the flap closed. As soon as it clicked unlocked, he opened it and withdrew quite a bit of parchment, ink, high-quality quills and documents. As he sat down on the chair at the end of the table, he straightened things up before him. He looked to Harry and said, "Mr. Potter, though you may not know it, I was your legal counsel through your guardians for your case against Mr. Schlock and the owners of Obscurus Books. I have now been contacted by your guardians to act as your legal counsel with regards to your being entered into the Triwizard Tournament, apparently against your wishes. For me to fulfill that role, I'm required to give an oath to act in your best interests. That will also require me to advise you to the best of my ability, even if that advice is not what you want to hear. Do you understand?" Harry nodded and replied, "I do, sir." He was surprised this was the same man who went after Schlock. He didn't know of his identity before then. "The oath also requires me to keep what we discuss as confidential. I cannot speak of it with anyone else other than you, my paralegal secretary, and those whom you implicitly allow me to speak of it with. My paralegal secretary is also bound by my oath. Do you understand?" "I do, sir," replied Harry. "Then, do you wish to secure my services as your legal counsel?" he asked. "Yes, sir," replied Harry. Mr. Screwhim then drew his wand and, holding it for the oath, intoned, "I, Dewey Riley Screwhim, barrister and solicitor, offer my services as legal counsel to Harry James Potter. I swear to keep his secrets as my own, to offer sound legal advice to the best of my ability and knowledge, to be faithful in my dealings with him, and at all times act within the precepts of the law of the land. On termination of my legal representation of him, I will continue to hold his secrets as my own. So say I, so mote it be." There was a muted flash of light signifying the oath took effect. He then resheathed his wand and slid a piece of paper over to Harry. "That is the oath I require my clients to take. Your guardians have already taken it. It includes your acceptance of my magically binding offer," he said. Harry read through the short oath and offered it to Cygnus to peruse. After Cygnus, Sirius, Amelia and Augusta all read it over and nodded in agreement. Harry took it up, popped out his own wand, and said, "I, Harry James Potter, accept Dewey Riley Screwhim, barrister and solicitor, as my legal counsel. I swear to keep his secrets as my own, to be faithful in my dealings with him, and recognize I have no claim against him if I do not act on his advice. So say I, so mote it be." Another flash, this time from Harry. He resheathed his wand. "Excellent," said Screwham. "Now that that's out of the way, please call me Dewey. May I call you Harry?" "Yes, sir, Dewey," said Harry, a little relieved. "Where would you like to start?" "Firstly, Harry, as your legal representation, I must ask if you're comfortable with all these people here being privy to what we discuss," he asked. "I am," nodded Harry firmly. "I have no secrets here." "Good," replied Dewey. "How about you start by telling me what you know and what you think happened? If necessary, I'll interrupt to ask questions to clarify matters." "Agreed." "Agreed," replied Harry. "I think it best to start with Dumbledore's speech welcoming the other two schools' representatives to the castle on Friday, the 30th of October, and working forward from there." Harry then went into detail of what happened both with the unveiling of the goblet, what he said to Dumbledore in front of everyone, and the next night, and what happened, including blowing a hole through the doors of the Great Hall to get out. He then covered what he and the group did to find out more information, including his discussion with Dumbledore that morning and their perusing of both the rules and the contract. And he covered the discussion the previous night, which led to an in-principle agreement with Luna of Lovegood Publishing for exclusive media rights. When he mentioned for how much he'd sold said rights, Cygnus and the others burst out laughing, and he said, "Slytherin! I told you, he's a Slytherin." He laughed even further when Neville very obviously offered a galleon to Daphne with a smirk at Cygnus as he did so. It just made Cygnus laugh all the harder. Even Dewey grinned with his eyes twinkling away when he heard why the agreement was made. "That is a very clever move, Harry. I'm impressed, and I don't often say that to anyone," he said. He then turned to Luna and asked, "Are you permitted to make such agreements, Miss Lovegood?" "The owner of Lovegood Publishing, my father, has verbally granted me the right to make suitable purchases and agreements up to the value of 1 galleon," she replied. "What? Luna?" mock exclaimed Harry, looking at his second protectee. You did me over. Nonsense, Harry, she smirked. I still claim your story is worth only 2 knots. I was being generous. Even Dewey laughed at that one. He said to Harry, I'm sure it won't drive you into bankruptcy. Turning back to Luna, with a grin he said, I shall draw up the contract, as discussed, and take it to your father at my first available opportunity. I must say, though, I hope you too, and Harry especially, will allow me to include this part at least in my memoirs. When I finally get around to writing them, I'll also admit that I may just use the same idea with other clients in the future. It is truly a very clever move. Turning more serious, he turned back to Harry and said, Once I have Mr. Lovegood's signature on the media exclusivity contract, I will send formal notification to all media outlets, informing them Harry is contractually bound to only talk to representatives of Lovegood Publishing. If they breach or even attempt to breach that, you are to inform me immediately. Harry nodded. Referring back to his notes, Dewey said, This is what I can tell you right now. Your name coming out of the goblet does mean you are bound by a magically binding contract, irrespective of how it came to be. However, it also means you are now magically recognized as an adult, as only adults can be bound by such agreements. Though the ministry or the law may or may not recognize it, magic does. You and your friends are also correct in that you are only bound to compete in the tournament. A quick skim through the contract and the rules shows me you are not required to take part in any other activity. And you are also correct in that you can refuse to be named as a champion. You are only a competitor. I shall endeavor to discover just what they mean by compete too, as you are also correct in that there does not appear to be a definition of that. I suspect it'll be the legal definition, in which case I'll peruse that and let you know. The conflicting parts of which your friends pointed out, of you needing to be of age to compete versus you must compete because your name came out of the goblet, is troublesome, that can be overcome by accepting emancipation. Emancipation means you will be of age. However, I shall need to cast my eyes more thoroughly over both documents before I will give up on that. Emancipation is a very big step to take. That had the adult guardians talking among themselves before Cygnus said, If it becomes necessary, then we'll just have to do that. Dewey continued, Besides the 3 tasks, which are on the 24th of November, the 24th of February, and the 24th of June, there is also the weighing of the wands ceremony on the 13th of November, and the Yule Ball on Christmas Day evening. However, it states champions are expected for both events, not the competitors, as it does for the tasks. So you are not required to attend either of those. That's up to you. The weighing of the wands and the Yule Ball are traditions, not tasks. As for the dates, it appears they intend to use this contract over and over again, as they have not included the year in which the tasks and events occur. It says, for example, that the first task will occur on the 24th of November, and not on the 24th of November 1993. Whichever mind drafted this document needs a legal spanking. It's somewhat clear to me that it wasn't a trained legal mind. Find what you can, said Harry. Anything that gets me out of this, even if it's a trivial technicality, I'm happy for you to use. Excellent, said Dewey. It does so make my job easier when a client listens to my advice. Straightening back up a little, he asked, Now, is there anything else you need to tell me before your guardians and I go and speak with Professor Dumbledore? No, replied Harry. At least, nothing I can think of. Dewey nodded and handed Harry a business card. If there is, contact me via OWL or through your guardians as soon as possible. Thank you, said Harry, accepting the card. While he was packing away his documentation, Hermione asked, Would you mind leaving us a copy of both the contract and rules? Harry should have a copy in case someone tries to bamboozle him. Of course, Dewey replied with a smile. He made a copy of both documents and slid the copy across the table to Hermione before completing packing his valise. When he stood, everyone stood with him. Turning to Cygnus, he asked, Shall we go and see the headmaster? Certainly, replied Cygnus. Should I come along? Asked Harry. Definitely not, replied Dewey. I don't want you, personally, anywhere near the man or the other officials from here on. All right? Yes, sir, replied Harry. Oh, and the password to get onto the stairs leading to the headmaster's office is gummy bears today. Dewey smiled back and gave a slight nod in return. After the adults left, Harry and the seven stayed behind to chat about what happened. Up in the headmaster's office, Dewey was quite calmly pointing out to Dumbledore his role as Harry's legal counsel, and how all matters regarding Harry were to be sent through him. Dumbledore exploded in anger, and in his anger he let slip a few salient points he would have rather not. "No," he shouted, "I cannot allow that. There are matters I must discuss with young Harry that are for his ears alone." "There most certainly are not," replied Dewey quite calmly. "Lord Greengrass has already laid out for you just how you may speak in private with Mr. Potter. But you will never be allowed to be alone with the boy. For a start, it would be unseemly. I'm sure you understand my concerns." Shocked, Dumbledore spluttered. "I would never." "And I never said you would," replied Dewey. "However, it would still be unseemly if it ever became public. I'm sure you recall a previous office holder of headmaster was summarily sacked and sentenced to Azkaban for such in the past. It would be a shame to see your reputation tarnished even further, probably irrecoverably, should such accusations be made public. The truth is irrelevant." When Dumbledore was about to splutter indignantly, Dewey continued, "No, headmaster, it could lead to great harm to Mr. Potter's reputation, of which I am now partly and legally responsible, for him to also be tarnished by such accusations, even if it would be as the perceived victim," mused Dewey. "Therefore, I must lend my not inconsiderable legal weight behind the limitations placed upon you by Lord Greengrass regarding Mr. Potter." Before Dumbledore could even begin to think a response, Dewey changed the subject and said, "Now on to the matters relating to the events which led to Mr. Potter's name being ejected from the Goblet of Fire. You have failed, quite spectacularly, I might add, in your duty to protect your students from harm. Headmaster, if anything happens to Mr. Potter, I dare say you will quite likely find yourself persona non grata in magical Britain from that moment forth. Imagine, because of your failure, you got the boy who lived killed. You may even be lucky to make it out of Britain." By the time the Guardians and Dewey left the office 2 hours later, they were all feeling quite smug with themselves. Dumbledore, however, was quite frazzled. He did not leave his office for the rest of the day. Of the points impressed upon him regarding the tournament, he was never to refer to Harry in any way as a champion, nor were any of the staff. That honour remained solely with Diggory, Crumb and Delacour. Harry was to be referred to only as the unwilling competitor. There were only 3 champions, not 4. It was the Triwizard Tournament, not the Quadwizard Tournament. While Harry was a competitor, his points were not to go towards winning the event. If at all possible, he was to receive 0 points. And Dewey and the Guardians would all be spectators of the events and would be watching for any deviation from those points. In the week that followed, Harry and the 7 were practically shunned by the other students. However, no one spoke ill of them, at least not where there was any risk of Harry hearing about it. However, that did not mean he wasn't given the cold shoulder treatment. Far from it. It did not bother him in the slightest, though, as he already had his circle of friends, and they all stood by him. On the Friday, Harry received a large letter from Dewey. In it was the contract between Harry and Lovegood Publishing that Harry asked Dewey to write up. The cover letter from Dewey explained the extra clauses he and Luna's father included and where they were. Reading through it, it was exactly what he wanted, including extra clauses related to terminating the contract by either party. Luna's father had already signed it, where applicable. Dewey's remarks also included that the contract would be magically filed as soon as he signed it, and a copy would replace it, clearly marked as a copy. Looking up at Luna, he smiled and said, "Your father's agreed to the contract, dear Luna." "I know," she said. "I received an owl from him yesterday about it. He's very pleased with me." Harry chuckled and, withdrawing ink and a quill from his bag, signed it in the required and indicated places. As soon as the last signature dried, there was a flash, and Harry had before him his own copy of the contract. Looking up at Luna, he said, "It's done, Lou. Lovegood Publishing are now the only media organization to whom I'm permitted to speak, or is permitted to write about me for the remainder of the school year." "Thank you, Harry," she said. "May I ask for the first interview to be held immediately after the first task?" Of course, he replied with a grin. I shall make myself available to you in your official capacity as a journalist for the Quibbler then. On the Friday, at breakfast, many of the students began wearing badges that said Support Cedric. Harry chuckled and asked one of the older Ravenclaws where he got them from, as he would like to wear one too. The student just scowled at him and stormed away. He later found out that Malfoy was the one who had paid for them. At lunch, however, Dumbledore stood and told everyone to remove them and immediately hand them over to their heads of houses. Apparently, there was a charm on them that changed the badge to say Potter stinks when Harry and the Seven were not in the vicinity. Except for the first years, you were all privy to what happened to Ravenclaw House when it was discovered they had been bullying one of their own, he said. This is another form of bullying. Anyone found in possession of such a badge or similar will be summarily suspended from school immediately and sent home. You have been warned. After lunch, he was in charms. Summoning charms, exclaimed Professor Flitwick. A most versatile and oft-used charm. A knock on the door burst in on the professor's little speech. It was Colin Creevey. He edged into the room, beaming at Harry, and walked up to Professor Flitwick's podium at the front of the room. Yes? Asked the professor. Please, sir, I'm supposed to take Harry Potter downstairs. Mr. Potter has another half-hour of charms to complete, said Professor Flitwick. What is this about? Colin went pink. Sir, Mr. Bagman wants him, he said nervously. All the champions have got to go. I think they want to take photographs. Harry would have given anything he owned to have stopped Colin saying those last few words. He chanced half a glance at Neville and Hermione. Very well, sighed Professor Flitwick. Mr. Potter, you may leave your things here. Please, sir, he's got to take his things with him, squeaked Colin. All the champions. Oh, very well, grumbled the little professor. Mr. Potter, you may go. That is not necessary, Professor, said Harry. I am not a champion. Ergo, I am not required. It appears Mr. Bagman is not aware of this. He then turned to Colin and said, Mr. Creevey, please pass on my respects to Mr. Bagman and inform him that I shall not be attending, as I am not a champion. If he needs, he may speak with Headmaster Dumbledore for clarification. Thank you. Harry, stuttered the younger boy, clearly worried. You really don't want to do that, do you? Sighed Harry. The other boy shook his head so rapidly his face became a blur. When he stopped, his hair was completely mussed and was still worried. All right, Mr. Creevey, please wait for me outside, said Harry. Turning back to Professor Flitwick, he said, My apologies, Professor. It appears the utter head farts responsible for this farce just can't seem to get it into the sewer sludge they claim as their brains that I am not a champion. I shall need to remonstrate with the man. Understood, Mr. Potter, replied the professor with a grin. We'll see you shortly. Grumbling under his breath, Harry reached into his bag and withdrew his copy of the contract. With it in his hand, he left the classroom. Colin was waiting for him outside. All right, Colin, said Harry, lead the way. As Colin walked with him down to wherever, Harry could see he was bursting with questions. Colin, has Miss Lovegood approached you for assistance as a photographer? Yet, no, she hasn't, replied the younger boy. Will she? I expect she might, replied Harry. Now, once we get inside, wherever it is you're taking me, I'm going to start yelling at people. Be assured, none of that yelling will be directed at you. Understand? I understand, replied Colin a little nervously. Good. I'm also going to be radiating a lot of magical power, all right? Yeah, I've seen you do that before. And you're about to see me do it again, said Harry. I suspect to see some of the adults in that room to use the vulgar shit themselves when I do it. You will be perfectly safe, I assure you. All right? Yeah, all right, said the boy. I trust you, Harry. Good lad, said Harry. What I want you to do is go inside and tell them I'm right behind you. Then get away from the door. Do you understand? Yeah, Harry, I can do that, replied Colin. Good, because I don't want you to get hurt, said Harry. After a few minutes more walking, Colin indicated a door and said, They're in there. Thank you, Colin, said Harry. Go on, then, and remember to get away from the door, right away. With a nod and setting himself, Colin walked rapidly up to the door and went in. Harry gathered his magic, waited a few moments and set his angry face on, then marched up to the door, popped his wand into his hand, and banishing the door open. The door slammed open and he strode in, magic swirling around him, his eyes glowing. "Bagman, you moron," he barked. "Where the hell are you?" There was a flash of camera. Instantly his wand came up and he summoned the camera to his hand. He fairly ripped the back of it open and ripped the film out before he dropped it on the floor and smashed it under his heel. Then he dropped the camera onto the remains. Looking at the gobsmacked photographer, a man with a slight paunch, he barked, "Startle me like that again, snot gobbler, and you better hope I don't retaliate with a cutting curse or similar." Turning back to everyone else in the room, he saw it was occupied by the three champions, Ludo Bagman, the idiot photographer, and some woman dressed in magenta robes. He was in a fairly small classroom. Most of the desks had been pushed away to the back of the room, leaving a large space in the middle. 3 of them, however, had been placed end-to-end in front of the blackboard and covered with a long length of velvet. 5 chairs had been set behind the velvet-covered desks, and Ludo Bagman was sitting in one of them next to the woman in magenta robes. He, like everyone else, was staring back in shock at Harry. Victor Crumb was standing moodily in a corner, as usual, and not talking to anybody. Diggory and the French Bint Delacour were obviously in conversation before he entered. Bagman stuttered, It's the W-weighing of the wand ceremony, Mr. Potter." Glaring back, Harry snarled, "Do you mean to tell me you've interrupted my study, the entire reason I'm in this school, for some half-assed bullshit ceremony?" Fidgeting and looking ready to bolt at any moment, Bagman replied, "We have to check that your wands are fully functional. No problems, you know, as they're your most important tools in the tasks ahead. The experts upstairs now with Dumbledore, and then there's going to be a little photo shoot. This is Rita Skeeter," he added, gesturing toward the witch in magenta robes. "She's doing a small piece on the tournament for the Daily Prophet." "No, she's fucking not," barked Harry, riding right over the man, who then cowered back. "I have an exclusive media contract, and it's not with the Daily Prophet." Swiveling his eyes to the woman in magenta, he barked, "You Skeeter?" Skeeter's hair was set in elaborate and curiously rigid curls that contrasted oddly with her heavy-jawed face. She wore jeweled spectacles. The thick fingers clutching her crocodile skin handbag ended in 2-inch nails, painted crimson. Bracing herself, she tried, "Yes, Mr. Potter? I wonder if I could have a little word with you before we start." She had guts, facing up to him like that. Harry spun about and cast his Patronus. Prongs. The Patronus turned to look at him. "Message to Dewey Screwhim, barrister and solicitor, Diagon Alley, London. I've just been approached by some numpty witch who goes by the name of Rita Skeeter, who purports herself to be a journalist from the Daily Prophet. She was already informed I was in an exclusive media contract, yet she has still tried to question me. You are free to go after her, Barnaby Cuff and the Daily Prophet. Have fun." Prongs gave a short nod and bounded out through the door. Spinning back to Skeeter, who was staring back in shock, he snarled, "In case you don't know what just happened, I just sicked my lawyer onto your ass, your boss's ass, and the Daily Prophet in general. Do not talk to me or report on me in any way. You're in enough shit as it is." Turning back to Bagman, who again cowered under his verbal onslaught, he barked, "As for you, you fat piece of dragon shit, magically binding contract or not, I am under no obligation whatsoever to take part in some fucked up ceremony. If I see you again before the first task on the 24th, I'm gonna ram my foot so far up your ass, I'm gonna knock your teeth out. Have I made myself perfectly clear?" Bagman just nodded his head rapidly back. Harry then glared around the room before spinning on his heel and storming out. Crumb moved forward towards Bagman and made as if to sniff the air. He then cast his amused eyes down at Bagman and said, "It appears, Mr. Bagman, you have soiled yourself." Delacour snickered. With a smirk, Diggory said, "And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why we never upset Harry." Harry stalked back to the charms classroom. By the time he had returned, he'd calmed down again. At dinner that night, Diggory approached him. He appeared quite amused. "Mr. Potter, may I have a word?" "Sure, Mr. Diggory," he replied with a small smile. "Here or elsewhere?" "Same place we discussed that other unpleasantness," he asked. "Why not?" said Harry. Looking back at the group, he said, "I'll be back in a tick or two." He rose and followed Diggory out of the hall. Of course, a lot of eyes followed him out. Entering the antechamber after Diggory, he found Crumb and Delacour were also there. He gave them each a curt nod before turning to Diggory. "Mr. Diggory." What you said today before the weighing of the wands?" the boy said. "Yes," asked Harry. "You said something about an exclusive media contract, and that Miss Skeeter couldn't talk to you," he said. "I did, and she can't," replied Harry. Crumb then asked, "How is this, how you say, possible?" "Ah," said Harry, "I have an exclusive media contract with Lovegood Publishing. No other media organization is allowed to approach me or even write a story about me. Miss Skeeter would have been informed of this from her boss, who was informed by my lawyer. Furthermore, no one is allowed to use my name, my image, or my story in any form without my and Lovegood Publishing's express permission." "And how much did this cost you?" asked Tall, Dark, and Broody. "Cost me?" asked Harry. He grinned and said, "It didn't cost me anything other than the cost of having the contract drawn up. Actually, I sold the rights to Lovegood Publishing for 3 nuts." "They pay you?" the Bulgarian asked in surprise. "Yes," replied Harry, with a nod and a smile. "However, the money only exists within the contract, so that money actually changes hands. Without the consideration, the contract would be void. Also in the contract is stipulations regarding truth and limitations on approaching me. Everything that is printed, written, painted, drawn, modelled, whatever, must be the absolute truth. In return, a journalist for Lovegood Publishing has the right to interview me no less than 3 times over the course of the year, but such interviews must be at a time and place suitable for the both of us." Delacour spoke up and asked, "How do we get contract like this?" Looking around the 3 of them, Harry asked, "I take it the 3 of you are interested in this?" "Oui, yes." Harry chuckled and said, "I'll let the Lovegood Publishing representative here at school know you're also interested in the same deal. And I shall send an owl to my lawyer tonight, letting him know the 3 of you want the same contracts. I hope 3 nut is a suitable compensation." "Oui da, yes." Nodding, he chuckled and asked, "Anything else?" "Yeah, tried Diggory. What you said about the wand ceremony you didn't have to attend? You 3 haven't read the contract you agreed to when you entered this thing, have you?" "No, non-net." Harry sighed and said, "Sorry, but that's not very clever, is it?" He gave them all an amused smile, to which even Crumb blushed a little. "Well," he began, "in a nutshell, you are required to compete in 3 tasks. Those 3 tasks will take place on the 24th of November, the 24th of February, and the 24th of June. That's it. You have no other legal obligations beyond that. Be also aware there is a Yule Ball to be held on the night of Christmas Day, for which the champions are expected to lead the first dance. Expected, not required. Understand? If anyone tries to tell you differently, and I'm sure they will, they're either knowingly or unknowingly lying to you. Now, as you 3 are currently contracted for this thing, you are entitled to a copy of both the contract and the rules. By law, they should have been given to you on the evening your name came out of the goblet. That they were not is illegal. So go and bloody demand a copy each, and for Merlin's sake, read them." "But why do you want to get out of this tournament?" asked Delacour. "Surely you would want the fame and the glory, no?" "Fame? Glory?" asked Harry with an amused smirk. "I'm the boy who lived. I'm recognized all over the world. I also slayed a 30-foot-long basilisk when I was 12, with a freaking sword. I don't need nor want fame. As for glory, what glory? Tell me, Miss Delacour, who won this thing last time." She tried, thinking furiously. "Exactly," said Harry, "and as for the 1,000 galleons prize money, I'm the head of one noble and most ancient house, the heir presumptive of a second, and betrothed to the heiress presumptive of a third. forgetting the last two as head of House Potter. I'm already worth hundreds of millions of galleons. Why the hell would I risk my life for what I consider pocket change? I've spent far more than that in one day's worth of shopping in Diagon Alley. You have left us with much to think about, Monsieur Potter, said Crumb, broodily brooding. I'm happy to have been of service, Mr. Crumb, said Harry. I'll talk to Luna of Lovegood Publishing tonight and send the owl off to my lawyer as well. Expect to hear from both over the next couple of days. Spasibo. Thank you. Mercy. Harry left the three of them quietly chatting with each other. Over the next couple of days, as promised, Harry approached Luna about offering the three champions the same deal he had with Lovegood Publishing. Luna was all for it and wrote her father. Harry sent an owl that same night to Dewey, who sent an owl back the next morning stating he too was in. In secret on the Sunday afternoon, the three champions met with Dewey in the etiquette club room and hashed out contracts customized for the three of them. Diggory's was the same as Harry's. Delacour's was similar, but with emphasis on the French newspapers, specifically Journals Magique, and Crumb was more difficult as Dewey had to speak to him about sponsorship and the like regarding his Quidditch career. Eventually, his was only for Magical Britain, but he promised to work with the young man regarding his career in future. In the end, the three and Dewey all came out happy. Harry told him to send the bill for all three to him. However, by the Thursday, the Daily Prophet was screaming bloody murder, as was, apparently, the Wizarding Wireless Network. The four competitors, again Harry slapped down Bagman for calling him a champion, together with Dewey, were in talks with the three headmasters, Crouch and Bagman. Dumbledore tried to have Snape and Moody present, but Dewey was very quick to chuck them out. Dumbledore and Madame Maxime were acting as if they didn't have a care in the world and were chatting academics with each other, while Crouch and Bagman were yelling at Dewey, who was trying not to laugh back at them, and was calmly repeating in various ways that his hands were tied. He was just that good a lawyer, he explained, that the contracts were ironclad. Karkaroff was spending his time trying to outbrood Crumb, while glaring or yelling at the boy and at Dewey. Crumb was sitting calmly, as were all the competitors, and ignoring everyone while chatting amiably with Delacour. At the same time, Harry and calmly Cedric Diggory were talking Quidditch while only paying a minor amount of attention to what was going on. Luna was also there and a little behind Harry, but seemed to be off in her own little world while happily humming to herself. When Crouch tried to turn his ire on her, Harry was out of his seat before a fourth yelled word left the man's mouth and had the tip of his wand pressed firmly into the man's throat and his magic swirling. With a feral grin on his face in the now completely and suddenly silent room, Harry quietly glared at the man and said, "Mr. Crouch, if you had bothered to pay even the slightest attention, you would know from the crest on Miss Lovegood's left shoulder that she is a protectee of House Potter. I take my role as protector very seriously. Back off, or I start carving pieces off you. Now apologize to the lady for your boorish behavior." Crouch went almost green in fear before he stammered a fearful apology at Luna. Luna just smiled happily and waved back. Delacour giggled at her reaction, which was essentially none. Crumb, who Harry was coming to like, loudly sniffed and said, "Mr. Bagman, it appears you have soiled yourself again." Harry, if he wasn't so angry with Crouch, probably would have laughed, as Delacour did anyway. Perhaps now would be a good time for a spot of tea, while Mr. Bagman goes and sorts himself out, said Dumbledore quite calmly, as if he was asking about the weather. When no one said a word back, he calmly called for a house elf, and they all found themselves with a cup of the hot beverage while Bagman disappeared for a while. Crouch spent the time glaring at Dewey and looking fearfully at Harry. It was only a few minutes before voices became raised again, and a minute later they were again yelling. After an hour, Harry stood and stretched. The room again went silent. When he relaxed into an easy stance, he said, genially, "Well, while watching adults yell at one another for no apparent purpose was fun for the first hour, I'm missing one of my favorite subjects, ancient runes." Looking at Dewey, he said, "Dewey, I can see you're still having loads of fun laughing at these two fools who can't seem to wrap their tiny little brains around the fact there's nothing they or you can do to change things. So I'll leave you to it. Everyone else, your time has expired. Turning to Luna, he said, Luna, dear, I think it would be best for you to leave with me. I don't want to see you subjected to any more negativity. Okay, Harry, she happily said, gathering her book bag, standing up and taking Harry's offered elbow. Where are you going, Mr. Potter? Called Dumbledore. Well, let's see, replied Harry before turning to Luna. Luna, dear, what class do you have on at this moment? Charms, I believe, she replied. Turning back to Dumbledore, Harry said, I'm escorting Miss Lovegood to the Charms classroom, and from there I'll be heading to the Ancient Runes classroom. He then smiled, raised his offhand, and with a twinkling of his fingers, gaily said, Toodles. As Harry turned and headed for the door, Dewey laughed. Immediately the yelling started up again, some even directed at Harry, who simply ignored it and walked out with Luna on his arm. He only made it about 100 feet down the corridor away from the gargoyle when he heard a laughing Cedric call out, Hey, Harry, wait up! When Harry turned around, the three champions were all hurrying up to him, grinning or openly laughing. Delacour, when she wasn't being mean, actually had a nice laugh. Even Crumb's face bore a grin. That was fun, he said, clearly happy. As all five walked away along the corridor, Harry superciliously said, Such is the power of having a lawyer in your pocket. Well worth the gold, I say. He received snickers of amusement in return. As the first task drew ever closer, Harry and the seven plus the Weasley twins worked as hard as they could to figure out a way to get Harry out of competing. Even Dewey was eventually forced to admit Harry would have to compete. With the support of Harry's guardians, he was trying to push through a declaration of emancipation, but the ministry was balking at it. The minister's office refused to sign off as was required, since Harry was headed for the Wizengamot once his lordship was available to him. Fudge wanted Harry nowhere near those seats. The night before the task, Harry and Daphne were the last two in their room. He was currently lying on a couch with his head resting in Daphne's lap, while she was almost idly running her fingers through his hair. When Harry found out from the twins, who had talked with their brother Charlie, the dragon wrangler, the first task involved a nesting mother dragon and a golden egg, he all but hyperventilated and passed out. How the hell am I supposed to get out of facing a bloody dragon, grumbled Harry. I'm 14 for Merlin's sake. You're also an incredibly powerful wizard when you draw power in, Harry, said Daphne. You know and can do enough charms and curses to get past a dragon, even if it is a nesting mother. All right, he said, from where he lay. I have to compete. However, I cannot compete because I'm not of age. I have to compete starting with the first task on the 24th of November. And it hit him. He had the answer. It ran like a freight train through his mind. He finally realized what it was that had been nagging him ever since he met Dewey for the first time. His head suddenly shot up out of Daphne's lap. Harry? She asked. He swung his legs around to sit properly forward on the couch. She could almost see the wheels spinning behind his eyes. Sweet Merlin, I've got it, he softly said. Got what, Harry? She asked, wondering what was going on with her suddenly excited betrothed. Ah, he replied, turning to her with a look of delight on his face. I know. Dewey and I've been thinking all backwards about this. I know how to not compete and not breach the contract when I do. Ha! The answer's been staring us in the face all along. All right, spill, said Daphne. What did you figure out? I don't need to think about how to get out of the contract. I needed to think about how not to compete, replied Harry with a large grin. That doesn't make much sense, frowned Daphne. Oh, it's actually quite simple, said Harry with a knowing grin. I need to run it past Dewey first, of course. I'll see him tomorrow before the task. But what I need to do is introducing the fourth champ. Competitor, Mr. Harry Potter. The announcer's Ludo Bagman's voice rang out over the stadium. Everyone looked expectantly to the gates leading into the stadium from where the other three contestants entered and exited after collecting their eggs, waiting for Harry to enter. Even the dragon was looking around expectantly, looking for threats. No one entered. Daphne was getting worried. Harry had told her to leave him a space next to her, and she had dutifully complied, leaving a reserved spot to her immediate left between her and Tracy. He had also told her he would come up there and sit with her to watch the other competitors compete. However, they all went ahead of him, and there had been no sign of her beloved since she left him at the entrance to the competitor's tent. After a few long moments, Bagman's voice rang out a second time, introducing the fourth competitor, Mr. Harry Potter. And still no one entered. Suddenly, she felt a hand land on her left shoulder. Reaching up with her own hand, it landed on a hand covered in the soft, silky feel of her Harry's invisibility cloak. She sucked in a deep breath in shock. She knew it was Harry because she felt his head of house ring on his ring finger under the cloth. And she could now smell the light musky smell of the cologne she bought for him for his last birthday. Once more the announcer's voice rang out, "Mr. Potter, you must come out and compete." She felt the weight of her Harry settle into the seat on the bench and cuddle up to her. "Are you ready to watch me beat these bastards?" he whispered into her ear. She nodded. Her heart was thumping away in her chest with worry, but she trusted her beloved. Harry quickly whipped off his invisibility cloak, causing those sitting nearby, who thought the spot empty, to suddenly gasp in surprise. The only ones who didn't were his guardians and Dewey, who were sitting behind him. He wrapped the cloak into a small ball and dropped it into Daphne's lap. Then he stood up. Drawing his wand, he firmly placed the tip against his own throat and cast the sonorous charm. "Excuse me, I'm afraid I'm not yet ready to compete. Sorry." Voices rose around the stadium. It didn't take them long to spot Harry standing in place in the stands between Daphne and Tracy. "Mr. Potter, you must enter the stadium floor and compete. If you do not, you will lose your magic. And I fully intend to enter the stadium floor and compete, sir, just not today." Harry watched as Bagman was about to speak again when the hand of Barty Crouch Sr. sitting next to him suddenly gripped his arm and held him back. Crouch then stood and cast his own sonorous charm. "Mr. Potter," his voice carried across the stadium seating, "the rules state, quite clearly, that this event will be held on the 24th of November. "Yes, sir," shot back Harry, "but the rules also state that I cannot participate in the tournament unless I am of age. If I do, then I am in breach of the rules. If I breach the rules, then I am in breach of the contract. If I breach the contract, I lose my magic. Therefore, sir, I cannot compete today." "If you do not compete, you will lose your magic, Mr. Potter. And, as I said, I fully intend to compete, just not today." "Then when do you intend to compete, Mr. Potter?" asked Crouch, clearly becoming quite agitated. That was the question Harry was waiting to hear. He grinned. "As you have already stated, the rules state this event must be held on the 24th of November. Therefore, in order to meet the condition of the contract that dictates this event is to be held on the 24th of November, and for me to meet the condition that I am of age, the earliest I can participate in this event is the 24th of November, 1997. "I'm terribly sorry, sir, but all these folks and that poor dragon down there are in for a very long wait. Mr. Potter, as you know, I am Bartemius Crouch, and I am the British Ministry representative responsible for the contract. It was the intent that the event be held today, sir." "Then that is what you should have included in the contract. Alas for you and these folks all gathered here today, you did not do that." There was a great deal of background chatter around Harry and throughout the stands. Crouch was bent over to his side and was arguing with someone before he straightened back up and glared back at Harry. "Then, under my authority, I'm changing the contract to reflect that the event will be held today." "Yes," thought Harry. Behind him he heard Dewey almost whoop in joy. "Firstly, sir, you do not want to do that," Harry calmly said. "The consequences are dire. Secondly, I would still have to be of age. As I would lose my magic anyway by competing, I still choose not to compete as the safer alternative. Then, sir, as the ranking representative of the minister present, the ministry deems you of age. Now you must compete." "Gotcha," thought Harry, as Dewey actually did whoop in joy and laughed. Looking around the spectators, Harry asked, "Are there any judges, other ministry officers, or anyone else who disagrees?" No one disagreed. Everyone else sat there in near silence except for muttering to one another, watching the drama unfold between two participants of the sonorous battle sitting almost across from one another in stadium seating. "No," Harry asked again. Well, the only way for the Ministry to deem me of age is to emancipate me and make me an emancipated minor, Harry reasonably said. Still no takers? Still no one said anything. He turned back and grinned at his guardians. Cygnus, wearing his own grin, offered him a thumbs up. Here we go, he thought. In that case, and on your authority, I, Harry James Potter, head of the noble and most ancient house of Potter, hereby acknowledge and accept I have been legally emancipated this day by the in situ representative of the Minister of Magic, Mr. Bartemius Crouch, having now come of legal age, hereby accept the lordship of the noble and most ancient house of Potter. So say I, so mote it be. Harry was suddenly surrounded by a quick flash of magical light that faded away. Thank you for that, he simply said. Now, as you have altered the conditions of a magically binding contract after it has been enacted, it falls to me and the other parties of the contract as the aggrieved parties to either agree or disagree with the alterations. As the or one of the then aggrieved party or parties, it falls to me by magical law to either accept the alterations, not accept the alterations, or vacate the contract in its entirety. That created a bit of a ruckus. Harry ignored it and soldiered on. I, Lord Harry James Potter, as aggrieved party of the unauthorized and unagreed alteration of the contract regarding the Triwizard Tournament by Mr. Bartemius Crouch, Ministry Representative to the Minister of Magic and signatory to the magically binding contract associated with the Triwizard Tournament this day, hereby vacate the contract enacted by the Goblet of Fire on the 31st of October 1994 and declare the contract terminated. So say I, so mote it be. There was another flash of magic. This time, Harry saw it was himself, Dumbledore, Karkaroff, Maxim and Crouch, who all flashed. He also suspected the three champions also flashed, but they were in the hospital tent and out of his sight. He continued, This tournament is now over unless you consign the three true champions, who actually want to compete, to a new contract. Finite. Harry plonked his bum back down onto the bench and turned to Daphne with a wide grin. Well, my love, shall we retire to the Great Hall for afternoon tea to celebrate my victory? Daphne grapple-hugged him and burst into tears. Prat! Dewey roared with laughter while his guardians all came forward laughing to hug them both. Bloody hell, pup, crowed Sirius. Best prank ever. Mr. Potter, called Crouch, still using his own sonorous. Mr. Potter. Harry ignored him. Taking his beloved's hand, Harry quickly led her off the stadium seating, and together they rushed back to the Great Hall, laughing all the way. The Guardians and Dewey took a more leisurely stroll. It was his intention to beat the journalists, especially Rita Skeeter, out of the stadium and back to the safety of the castle walls. Running into the Great Hall and laughing, they were greeted by those students who could not secure seating in the stadium and didn't have a class on at the time. Well, asked one of the female Ravenclaw third years, how did you do? My intellectual genius of a betrothed, replied Daphne, utterly outsmarted them and didn't have to compete. He also managed to get the tournament cancelled until such time as they re-signed the three true champions. And there's nothing they can do about it. How? How on earth did you manage that? The girl asked, a little shocked. Quite simple, my dear Miss Fawcett, said a grinning Harry, by using their own weapon against them. As they used the conditions of the contract to force me to compete in the first place, I used the conditions of the contract to force them to delay the tournament until the 24th of November 1997, when they then tried to force through a change to the contract to again try to force me to compete today. I used that to vacate the contract, thereby cancelling it. Not a couple of minutes later, and the official delegation of judges and ministry flunkies entered the Great Hall. They were followed by Harry's guardians, Dewey and the rest of the 8. As soon as one of the official delegation spotted Harry sitting halfway along the Ravenclaw table, he indicated Harry to the rest and the whole body made a beeline for him. Ludo Bagman was in the lead. Harry just sat there and pretended to ignore them. Mr. Potter, barked the balding, overly round, middle-aged wizard. Ludo Bagman. Mr. Bagman, barked Harry right back, and it's Lord Potter, you fat, pompous gnat. Everyone that was in the Great Hall immediately fell silent and watched the entertainment happening amidst them. Mr. Potter, you will return to the stadium right this minute and compete in the tournament, snarled the old Quidditch player. Mr. Bagman, you will drop to your knees, pucker up and kiss my hairy bum, snarled Harry right back. And it's Lord Potter again, you blowhard. While Bagman stood there blustering away, Barty Crouch stepped forward as the second person of the Ministry tag team. Mr. Potter, tried Crouch. Lord Potter, snarled Harry. Mr. Potter, while that was a very clever attempt to sabotage the Triwizard Tournament, I'm afraid you still must compete, or you will lose your magic, he said, trying to sound calm while speaking through a clenched jaw. No, he won't, said Dewey, stepping forward from behind. As Lord Potter's legal representative, I assure you he does not. Crouch got all flustered and babbled a bit. Squib Crouch, said Harry, calling the man's attention back. While your not-so-clever attempt to get me to actually compete in an event I'm not obligated to do so might sound perfectly logical to you, I'm afraid you're probably suffering from the effects of your magic slowly draining away, and are sounding like an idiot. What do you mean, my magic? He growled. Well, Squib to be, you just broke a magically binding contract by altering the conditions of said contract when you were not legally allowed to do so. One enforced by the Goblet of Fire. That means it's your magic that will be stripped, not mine, replied Harry quite reasonably. Crouch stood there for a few moments, unable to make much of a sound, as his jaw worked and his hands kept clenching and unclenching into fists. However, his skin took on quite the sickly pallor. Dewey calmly said, "He is correct, Mr. Crouch." Crouch spun around to face the other officials. As soon as his eyes alighted on Dumbledore, he bellowed, "Dumbledore, make him compete." "I'm sorry, Bartemius," replied Dumbledore in a calm voice, "but I'm afraid Lord Potter's and Mr. Screwham's reading of both the contract and the rules of the tournament are correct. While the contract stated the event was to be held on the 24th of November, it certainly did not mention the year. I must say, I am quite surprised to find such an amateurish mistake in a document you charged to be written. Did you not carefully review it first, before accepting it and signing it?" Daphne put in her 2 nuts and said, "And I also must say, you're looking quite ill, Mr. Crouch. Perhaps someone should escort you to the infirmary for Madame Pomfrey to have a look at you. After all, if my betrothed, Lord Potter, is correct, you may very well already be suffering from the effects of the beginning of you losing your magic." "Squib Crouch," called Harry as the man was about to turn around. The man turned and glared back. "On the night the names were discharged from the Goblet of Fire, I believe everyone would have willingly agreed to vacate the contract and start again, and everything would have worked out," said Harry. "From what I understand, the sole opponent to that idea was you. You may very well be losing your magic right now, and I dare say you are, and it's your own pig-headed obstructionist fault. Good day, sir." As most of the official party left the hall again, with both Bagman and Crouch ranting at Dumbledore, Madame Maxime remained. When the party was far enough away, she turned to Harry and said, "Lord Potter, it is a very brave thing you are doing and take a great risk. I feel I must commend you for your actions, and wish you luck. Good day, young man." "Thank you, Madame Maxime," replied Harry before she could leave. "I trust you are now of the opinion I was not a willing participant of this farce." "Indeed, Lord Potter," she replied with a slight bow before leaving. As Madame Maxime strode out of the great hall, Cygnus, Isabel, Sirius, Gran, and Dewey all came forward. Harry gestured them into seats opposite while grinning like a loon. "Where's Aunt Amelia?" he asked. "She had to return to the Ministry, where she's going to keep an eye on anyone trying to do any hanky-panky with the Ministry's own copy of the contract," replied Cygnus. "Plus, it's a work day, so—" Harry turned to Dewey and asked, "So, we're good?" "Definitely," replied Dewey. "You did everything right, though you legally did not need to. You even described what you were doing as you did it. So no one can now accuse you of being lucky. If you're considering a career in law when you graduate, I hope you'll come and see me. You've the mind needed to think outside the box for a career arguing contract law." Harry grinned and said, "I'm afraid you're going to have to wait in line. There are others who have expressed similar sentiments regarding other careers." As they were talking, a large barn owl flew in and alighted in front of Harry. It bore an owl harness with the crest of Gryffindor stamped upon it. Tied to the harness was a letter. "Well, hello you," Harry said to it as he reached out and removed the letter. Daphne reached out and offered the bird an owl treat. Harry, as he was dressed to compete, was not carrying any of them on him. Opening the letter, a short one compared to the usual missive Harry received as the head of an ancient house, Harry read, "Lord Harry James Potter, head and lord of the noble and most ancient house of Potter. Lord Potter, on behalf of Axlord Ragnarok, may his reign be long and his vaults ever full, I offer you congratulations on your emancipation and elevation to your lordship. As you have now attained your birthright, I request your attendance at your earliest convenience at the London branch of Gringotts Bank. The purpose of the meeting is for you to sign the requisite parchment work to open the remaining vaults to you. Further, now that you are legally of age and considered an adult under wizarding law, there are other matters I need to raise with you I would be uncomfortable, including in this note due to the sensitivity of the information. Once more, congratulations on your emancipation and elevation to your lordship. Bloodfang Rune Rock, Master Account Keeper for the noble and most ancient house of Potter. Gryffindor Bank. Harry handed the letter for Cygnus to take, but Cygnus smiled and said, "Harry, you're emancipated now. You're an adult, so I'm no longer your magical guardian." Harry blinked as he hadn't thought of that. He said, "But still, our houses are allied and I still cherish your wise counsel, if you wouldn't mind." Cygnus smiled and said, "Thank you, Harry," before taking the letter and reading it. Handing it back after he read it, he said, "Well, at least we know that part of what you did out there is valid." Harry nodded and handed the letter next to Dewey. Taking it and reading it, Dewey said, "Confirmation is always welcome. That the goblins' records have reflected the emancipation means that magic has accepted it as valid. The ministry cannot override it." Said Harry with the verbal nod. "But that other matters concerns me." He accepted the letter back from Dewey and handed it to Sirius. After Sirius read it and handed it back, Harry handed it to Gran. "What have you got on this afternoon, Harry?" asked Sirius. "Herbology with the lions," he replied. "Double period, and astronomy with Daphne's house is on after midnight. Tonight. I think we need to get you into Gringotts this afternoon," said Sirius, as Harry accepted the letter from Gran and handed it to Isabel. It is unlike them to be reticent to include all relevant information in their correspondence. Cygnus nodded and said, "Agreed." He turned to Daphne and asked, "What do you have on this afternoon?" "History of magic with the Puffs," she immediately replied. "But you've already given me a permission to be excused from that." Isabel then handed the letter back, and Harry handed it to Daphne. Looking to Dewey with a smirk, Harry asked, "Any advice from legal counsel?" Dewey grinned, wiped a fake tear from his eye, sniffled and said, "I have a client who seeks my advice before acting. I must be in heaven." The adults chuckled while Dewey said, "Go now." "That is troubling," said Daphne, frowning as she handed the letter back. "Then it's unanimous," said Harry. "I need parchment, ink and quill." He began to look around a little until Daphne whacked him lightly on the arm with her fountain pen. Turning back to her, he saw her smirk and hold the pen for him. "Sorry," he blushed. He accepted the pen and looked down the table to some younger-year Ravenclaws, who were using the table to supposedly do homework, but spent most of the time watching Harry and his party. Immediately catching the attention of one of the younger girls, he asked, "Ladies, might I seek your indulgence for a sheet of parchment?" The girls blushed and giggled, and one slid a small sheet of parchment down the table. Daphne rolled her eyes while Cygnus snorted, and Sirius said, "Damn pup, betrothed on your arm and you're still sweet-talking the ladies." Isabel whacked him on the arm and said, "Shoosh, you." He was just being courteous. Harry just grinned as he uncapped the fountain pen and placed the sheet of parchment before himself ready to write. So, a quick message to Professor Flitwick informing him Daphne and I needed to urgently leave the school for Diagon Alley due to urgent House Potter business. Cygnus nodded and said, "Based on advice from House advisors and legal counsel, blah blah blah." Harry nodded and quickly wrote out the note. As he was finishing, Isabel said, "Sign it, Lord Harry James Potter, just so there's no misunderstanding." Harry nodded again and did so. Looking up and capping the fountain pen before handing it back to Daphne, he said, "Now I just need someone to deliver it," and saw Tracy and Luna walk in. They came over and sat down between their party and the young girls who gave him the parchment. "Problem?" asked Daphne of Tracy. The other girl shook her head and said, "No, we had a single period of history of magic this afternoon, remember? And Luna wasn't allowed into her double period of potions, because the class had already started before she got there from the arena. We met coming out of the dungeons." "In that case," said Harry, "could one of you please hand this to Professor Flitwick after the last class this afternoon," sliding the sheet of parchment before the two newest arrivals. "Daphne and I have urgent business to attend at Gringotts." "I'll take it," said Luna in her dreamy voice. "I'll be heading up to Ravenclaw in a little while, and I'll put it in his head-of-house mailbox for you." "Actually, Harry," said Isabel, "you'll need to head up there anyway. You really don't want your first foray into Diagon Alley and Gringotts as Lord Potter to be while you're wearing your competitor's outfit." Harry sighed and said, "Dang it, I was hoping no one would notice." Isabel just smiled back and said, "Not notice the boy who lived walking among them? Not likely." "Fine," grouched Harry. "We'll be as quick as we can." Taking the note back from Luna with his thanks and putting it in his pocket, Harry climbed to his feet and assisted Daphne to do the same. He didn't notice Isabel nod her head in approval of his actions. They quickly made their way out of the Great Hall, passing a gaggle of Beauxbatons students who had just entered. "Voyez-vous plus tard, mes amis," called Harry over his shoulder as he and Daphne walked arm in arm heading out of the doors. One of the Beauxbaton girls called back, "Your pronunciation is atrocious, Lord Potter." Harry just blew her a raspberry over his shoulder as he escorted Daphne from the hall with his head held high. The gaggle giggled. From where he was still sitting at the Ravenclaw table, Sirius sighed and said, "I swear on Merlin's wand, if that boy wasn't already betrothed and clearly in love with Daphne, he'd be beating them off with a stick." Isabel leaned over and said, "Daphne wrote to me and told me there are at least 3 Vila among the Beauxbaton students. And all 3 at least have been making goo-goo eyes at him. He hasn't even noticed." "Really?" asked Sirius in surprise. "Damn, the boy's got it bad." Isabel smiled, but still gave him a whack on his arm. "On top of that, thank you very much. I don't think he's figured it out yet." "Figured what out?" asked Sirius with a pout while massaging his arm. "He's emancipated," sighed Isabel, as if talking to a particularly dense child. "Yes, and?" asked Sirius. Isabel just shook her head and said, "You'll figure it out." A quick trip down to the dungeons, escorting Daphne, and a dash up the secret passages to the Ravenclaw tower to change and drop off his note. Harry quickly returned to the entrance hall. He cast a couple of quick photography cantrips on himself and strode back into the great hall with his head held high like a proper lord. When he reached the head of the Ravenclaw table, he spun on the spot and struck a pose. His hair was perfectly coiffed, his eyes sparkled, his teeth glinted as he grinned, and his robes fluttered as if in a light breeze. He was dressed every inch the image of a lord of a noble and most ancient house. His deep black outer robes were of the finest acromantilla silk. His crest rode upon his right breast. His under robes were a quality business attire of deep green trimmed in black, his pure cotton shirt startlingly white. With one finger of his left hand pointed in the air for dramatic effect, while his other hand rested on a cocked hip, displaying his head-of-house ring for all to see, he proclaimed, "Never fear, for I am here," and struck another pose. A couple of the young girls sitting near the head of the Ravenclaw table loudly sighed and pretended to swoon before giggling madly. Cygnus and Sirius both roared with laughter, while Isabel and Gran both tutted and rolled their eyes. "Really, Mr. Potter," came the voice of Professor McGonagall from behind him. "Ah," said Harry, surprised before he could internally recover. "Such dulcet and melodious tones are truly music to my unworthy ears. It must be an angel come to give me her blessings." He turned around to see Professor McGonagall standing over near the head table. She stood there, trying hard not to smirk back. It wasn't helping her that Cygnus was head down on the Ravenclaw table, guffawing and slapping the tabletop, or that Sirius had fallen backwards off the bench and was rolling on his back on the floor, laughing his butt off. "Professor McGonagall," Harry cheekily exclaimed in a chipper voice, "what an absolute joy it is to see you. My day keeps getting better and better." Without even saying a word, the oft-stern Transfiguration's professor hesitated for the barest of moments before she spun about and hurried out of the hall via the teacher's entrance. He also hadn't noticed that Daphne had entered the hall and come up the side of the table to look down at a giggling Sirius lying on the floor. "Really, Lord Black," she expostulated, "is this the behavior we should come to expect from the lord of an ancient house?" And looked over at her father, who had hiccups and tears in his eyes from laughing too much. "Darling," said Harry overly gaily as he spun on hearing her voice. "Harry James Potter," she glared at Harry, "what have you done to two of our lords?" Sirius had finally managed to regain control of himself and was using the bench to try and regain his feet. "I have merely provided light and humorous entertainment, while others have engaged in jovial conversation and contemplative study," he brightly replied with a flourishing bow. That set the two men off a little again. "You broke them," she sternly said. "Nay, darling," replied Harry, "they are merely appreciative connoisseurs of fine humour and gaiety." Daphne just rolled her eyes and sighed. Gran smirked and said, "I think we best leave while we still can," before she stood and cast a quick cleaning charm to the back of Sirius's robes. The other adults rose as Harry came back around. He offered his elbow with a flourish and said, "May I have the honour of escorting my lady?" The Daphne glared at him and asked, "What have you been drinking?" But she took his elbow as they began to head for the main doors. With a cheeky grin, he replied, "I have supped from the fountain of life only, dear heart. Verily, I find myself somewhat giddy in the joy of existence." "Verily?" asked Daphne, glancing over and cocking an eyebrow. "Only you would think a word like verily is still used in common parlance," says the lady who used the word parlance in a like manner, he retorted. From behind, Harry heard the adults snickering and chatting. After being side-along apparated from outside the front gates of the castle to the apparition point in Diagon Alley, their little party made their way into Gringotts. Just inside the doors, they were greeted by a goblin who had hurried over. He bowed to Cygnus, Sirius, and Harry before he said, "Lord Potter, Master Account Keeper Bloodfang is expecting you. Please follow me." He spun on the spot and marched off across the hall to the doors at the rear. Still escorting Daphne, he followed along as they were led down the back hallway to the doors, wherein he knew Bloodfang made his office. After being bid to enter, the party filed inside. Harry made the introductions before he and Daphne took seat in front, with the adults seated behind along the back wall. "Lord Potter," began Bloodfang, "I'm pleased you have decided to attend Gringotts with such haste." "Your missive implied haste was needed," said Harry. "Indeed," replied Bloodfang, "the minister is not happy you have taken your mantle as lord. He has attempted to block you access by way of ministerial decree." "He dares?" exclaimed Cygnus. "He does," replied Bloodfang as he slid parchment work across his desk to Harry. "My lord, I need you to sign these documents. Once they are signed, they will be magically filed, both here and at the ministry. Once that is done, the minister's current efforts to have you stripped of your lordship will be circumvented." Dewey came forward and read the documents over Harry's shoulder. Bloodfang also placed before Harry a blood quill ready to sign each document. As Dewey finished each, he tapped it and said to Harry, "Sign it," which Harry did. As he signed the last document and they were slid back to Bloodfang, Harry asked, "You said the minister's current efforts. Do you anticipate others?" "Yes," replied Bloodfang. "Our informants within the ministry believe he is attempting to have your lordship overturned by having you stripped of your emancipation." He then hesitated a few moments before he said, "However, there is one sure way that it cannot happen." Harry stared at Bloodfang and frowned. "You're being reticent in telling me how, my friend. That is quite unlike you." Bloodfang placed the seal of Gringotts on each document before tapping the seal and causing the document to vanish with a flash of magic. Once he was done, Bloodfang looked back at Harry and said, "The betrothal contract between yourself and Lady Daphne," he gestured to her, "states that you are to marry once you come of age. It does not, however, state Lady Daphne must also be of age." Harry gasped in surprise. Daphne suddenly gripped Harry's left hand very tightly, while he was madly reading the contract in his mind. After a few moments he sighed and said, "Damn. No, it doesn't." Turning to Daphne, he said, "I'm so sorry. I did not consider the impact my becoming emancipated would have on our betrothal contract." Cygnus cleared his throat and said, "Harry, this was somewhat anticipated. As you are a little over a month younger than Daphne, it was always expected she would be of age before you. As such, we never considered the possibility of you being emancipated at such an early age. However, we also knew this might be a possibility if Dewey's other efforts to have you removed from the tournament failed." Harry nodded and looked back at Bloodfang. "How would our being married circumvent the minister?" "A marriage ceremony undergone with the blessing of magic cannot be undone without the blessing of magic," replied Bloodfang. "Once you are married, the ministry cannot strip you of your emancipation, even if you wanted to be." "It seems like using a war axe to cut kindling to me," sighed Harry. He turned to the adults and said, "Now that those documents are signed and filed, it's going to take time for the minister to shift his focus. I'd rather call the minister out for attempting to interfere in the practices of an ancient house than be forced to marry so soon when we're both not ready for that commitment." Cygnus nodded and said, "I'll speak directly with the chief witch, Griselda Marchbanks, and demand an emergency session of the Wizengamot." "I'll second it," interrupted Sirius. "Thank you," said Cygnus with a nod towards Sirius. "We'll need a Wizengamot-led investigation into the actions of the minister. If necessary, a vote of no confidence in him will also need to be filed. While it might not work, it'll hamstring him in taking any further pro-action until it's resolved. If I've already taken my seat in the Wizengamot, that will put paid to his shenanigans as well," said Harry. Cygnus sat thinking for a little while and said, "The last time anyone was allowed to take their seat in an emergency session of the Wizengamot was during the last war, and even then, the emergency session was for the purpose of allowing that to happen." "There's no reason an emergency session has to be for only one item," said Harry. "It could be to allow me to take my seat and to start an investigation into the actions of the minister." "Good point," mused Cygnus. He turned to Gran and asked, "Augusta, your current regent for House Potter. Well, you would be proxy now. How do you feel about this?" Gran nodded and said, "Let's get Harry inducted onto the Wizengamot. He can then, if he wishes, retain me as proxy. I think Griselda will call the emergency session once we explain to her what Cornelius is up to. She's never liked the idea of the ministry interfering with the business of the ancient houses." Harry turned to Daphne and said, "Daphne, please don't think I'm trying to find a way out of marrying you. I'm not. I'm trying to find a way out of marrying you right now because I have to. I want you to have the big, lavish wedding you and your mum have probably dreamed about, and being forced into it right now will deny you that." Daphne smiled back and said, "I know, but thank you for being considerate enough to think of my feelings in this." Harry smiled back before turning to Bloodfang. "My friend, I'm going to need the documentation for me to take my seat on the Wizengamot and then hand my proxy off to Madame Longbottom. We'll be holding off on the marriage ceremony for now, but have the parchment work ready just in case." Bloodfang nodded and got to work by drawing out a couple of sheets of parchment and his quill. Harry turned back to the adults and asked Dewey, "Dewey, you've been awful quiet. Do you think the emergency session is the way to go forward?" He nodded and said, "I do." "All right," said Cygnus. "We have a plan of action plus a fallback if it's needed. Once Bloodfang's finished the parchment work, we need to head directly to speak with Madame Marchbanks. We have a fair bit to do and not a lot of time to do it before the minister tries something else." "But why is the minister so determined to stop Harry taking up his lordship?" asked Isabel. "He's not," replied Cygnus. "It'll be Malfoy and his ilk. I dare say they've had this ready to go since Dewey and I first applied for Harry to be emancipated a few weeks ago. Fudge wouldn't have done anything unless Malfoy told him to." From the bank, the party, except for Dewey, headed directly to the ministry. Dewey headed back to his own offices. They found Madame Marchbanks in the Chief Witch's office, the place she would often be found since the ouster of Dumbledore, and where he was rarely found. Entering the outer office, Cygnus approached the young secretary and asked, Could you please inform the Chief Witch that Lords Greengrass, Black and Potter, and Lady Greengrass and Dowager Lady Longbottom would like a word?" The young witch looked up with a bit of awe before she hurriedly rose from her desk and said, "One moment, my lords and ladies." She dashed to the door of the Chief Witch, knocked quickly and ducked inside. A few moments later, she came out and held the door open. "Madam Marchbanks will see you now," she said. The party entered the office to Madam Marchbanks, struggling to rise from behind her desk. "Sit down, please, Griselda," said Cygnus. "None of us expect you to rise for us, you know that." With a nod, the old witch retook her seat and drew it back into her desk. With a light cough, she asked, "Cygnus, I take it this is an urgent matter?" Sirius conjured more seating across from the Chief Witch, and the party took seats. "Yes, Griselda, it is," replied Cygnus, sitting down. "Fudge has just attempted to strip a new lord of his emancipation within mere hours of him accepting it, and is attempting to stop the boy from taking his rightful seat." Madam Marchbanks frowned and said, "That's a pretty damning allegation. Perhaps you should start at the beginning, and let me see if I can determine what is going on." Cygnus then ran through the events of the day and what they had discovered when they visited Gringotts. As he talked, she questioned, and Harry realized that though she was of great age, she was still a very sharp lady. It added to the high esteem he held of her from the trials. When Cygnus finished, the Chief Witch turned to Harry and asked, "I take it is your intention to retain your lordship and take seat on the Wizengamot?" "To retain my lordship and hand my proxy over to Madam Longbottom," he easily replied. "I find myself quite offended the minister is attempting to deny me my rightful seat before he has even met me to make such a decision." "Indeed," she said, "such actions offend me too." She leaned back in her chair and said to Cygnus, "Under my authority, I'll call the emergency session for tomorrow evening." "I agree. It appears necessary young Lord Potter should be inducted into the Wizengamot with all due haste. And I further agree the Wizengamot needs, through its own authority, to investigate the minister in his actions. However, I won't allow the investigation to be, if you'll pardon the pun, a witch hunt. The investigation will be specific in finding out why the minister is trying to block Mr. Potter's elevation, that is all. We'll also put in place an embargo on the minister and the ministry taking any such action until the investigation is complete." "That's all we ask, Griselda," said Cygnus. "Thank you." After the meeting, and back out in the atrium, Harry said, "Nice lady." Cygnus said, "She is. One of the few within the ministry I'm confident to say is completely incorruptible. She can also be utterly ruthless when she wants to be." Escorted by Sirius, Harry and Daphne flew back to Diagon Alley so Harry could be fitted with Wizengamot robes at Madame Malkine's. As they needed to be customized with the Potter House crest, he promised he would return early the next evening to pick them up before fleeing to the ministry. Afterwards, he, Daphne, and Sirius flew to Hogsmeade and walked to the gates of the castle. Sirius bid them a safe walk back and headed back to the ministry to meet up with Cygnus, Isabel, and Gran. The Greengrasses and Madame Longbottom stayed at the ministry. They claimed other business to which they needed to attend. Harry suspected they would be questioning their own contacts to see if they could discover just why they were attempting to deny Harry his emancipation and lordship. Harry and Daphne had returned late afternoon and headed to their dorms to get changed out of their spiffy robes back into school robes. They met up again in the come-and-go room. The first to see Harry walk in, Neville asked, "How'd it go?" Harry explained what he, Daphne, and the adults discovered, and what he and the others then did to block the attempted circumvention. "So, I'm going to have to get spiffed up again tomorrow, early evening, and head to the Wizengamot chambers. Sirius will be waiting for me outside the gates to escort me," he said. He hadn't heard Daphne walk in, and didn't know she was there until she said, "He'll be escorting us, Harry. I intend to be there to see you inducted." Harry turned and smiled. "You don't have to, you know," he said. "I want to," she said, walking around the lounges and sofa to take a seat at his normal seat. Harry joined her and softly said, "Thank you, I'd like that." She smiled and kissed him on the cheek. Turning to the others, she said, "Anyway, homework from today?" Hermione handed over what she'd written down for herbology to Harry and Dada to Daphne, and they were quickly working on long assignments. Harry received his potions assignment from Susan and an explanation of the potion they made. The adults chuckled while Dewey said, "Go now." "That is troubling," said Daphne, frowning as she handed the letter back. "Then it's unanimous," said Harry. "I need parchment, ink and quill." He began to look around a little until Daphne whacked him lightly on the arm with her fountain pen. Turning back to her, he saw her smirk and hold the pen for him. "Sorry?" he blushed. He accepted the pen and looked down the table to some younger-year Ravenclaws who were using the table to supposedly do homework, but spent most of the time watching Harry and his party. Immediately catching the attention of one of the younger girls, he asked, "Ladies, might I seek your indulgence for a sheet of parchment?" The girls blushed and giggled, and one slid a small sheet of parchment down the table. Daphne rolled her eyes while Cygnus snorted, and Sirius said, "Damn, pup, betrothed on your arm, and you're still sweet-talking the ladies." Isabel whacked him on the arm and said, "Shush, you." He was just being courteous. Harry just grinned as he uncapped the fountain pen and placed the sheet of parchment before himself, ready to write. So, a quick message to Professor Flitwick informing him Daphne and I needed to urgently leave the school for Diagon Alley due to urgent House Potter business. Cygnus nodded and said, "Based on advice from House advisors and legal counsel, blah, blah, blah." Harry nodded and quickly wrote out the note. As he was finishing, Isabel said, "Sign it, Lord Harry James Potter, just so there's no misunderstanding." Harry nodded again and did so. Looking up and capping the fountain pen before handing it back to Daphne, he said, "Now I just need someone to deliver it," and saw Tracy and Luna walk in. They came over and sat down between their party and the young girls who gave him the parchment. "Problem?" asked Daphne of Tracy. The other girl shook her head and said, "No. We had a single period of history of magic this afternoon, remember? And Luna wasn't allowed into her double period of potions because the class had already started before she got there from the arena. We met coming out of the dungeons." "In that case," said Harry, "could one of you please hand this to Professor Flitwick after the last class this afternoon?" Sliding the sheet of parchment before the two newest arrivals, "Daphne and I have urgent business to attend at Gringotts." "I'll take it," said Luna in her dreamy voice. "I'll be heading up to Ravenclaw in a little while, and I'll put it in his head of house mailbox for you." "Actually, Harry," said Isabel, "you'll need to head up there anyway. You really don't want your first foray into Diagon Alley and Gringotts as Lord Potter to be while you're wearing your competitor's outfit." Harry sighed and said, "Dang it, I was hoping no one would notice." Isabel just smiled back and said, "Not notice the boy who lived walking among them? Not likely." "Fine," grouched Harry. "We'll be as quick as we can." Taking the note back from Luna with his thanks and putting it in his pocket, Harry climbed to his feet and assisted Daphne to do the same. He didn't notice Isabel nod her head in approval of his actions. They quickly made their way out of the Great Hall, passing a gaggle of Beauxbaton students who had just entered. "Voyez-vous plus tard, mes amis?" called Harry over his shoulder as he and Daphne walked arm in arm heading out of the doors. One of the Beauxbaton girls called back, "Your pronunciation is atrocious, Lord Potter." Harry just blew her a raspberry over his shoulder as he escorted Daphne from the hall with his head held high. The gaggle giggled. From where he was still sitting at the Ravenclaw table, Sirius sighed and said, "I swear on Merlin's wand, if that boy wasn't already betrothed and clearly in love with Daphne, he'd be beating them off with a stick." Isabel leaned over and said, "Daphne wrote to me and told me there are at least 3 Vila among the Beauxbaton students. And all 3 at least have been making goo-goo eyes at him. He hasn't even noticed." "Really?" asked Sirius in surprise. "Damn. The boy's got it bad." Isabel smiled, but still gave him a whack on his arm. "On top of that, thank you very much. I don't think he's figured it out yet." "Figured what out?" asked Sirius with a pout while massaging his arm. "He's emancipated," sighed Isabel, as if talking to a particularly dense child. "Yes, and?" asked Sirius. Isabel just shook her head and said, "You'll figure it out." A quick trip down to the dungeons, escorting Daphne, and a dash up the secret passages to the Ravenclaw Tower to change and drop off his note. Harry quickly returned to the entrance hall. He cast a couple of quick photography cantrips on himself and strode back into the great hall with his head held high like a proper lord. When he reached the head of the Ravenclaw table, he spun on the spot and struck a pose. His hair was perfectly coiffed, his eyes sparkled, his teeth glinted as he grinned, and his robes fluttered as if in a light breeze. He was dressed every inch the image of a lord of a noble and most ancient house. His deep black outer robes were of the finest acromantula silk. His crest rode upon his right breast. His under-robes were a quality business attire of deep green trimmed in black. His pure cotton shirt, startlingly white, with one finger of his left hand pointed in the air for dramatic effect, while his other hand rested on a cocked hip, displaying his head of house ring for all to see. He proclaimed, "Never fear, for I am here," and struck another pose. A couple of the young girls sitting near the head of the Ravenclaw table loudly sighed and pretended to swoon before giggling madly. Cygnus and Sirius both roared with laughter, while Isabel and Gran both tutted and rolled their eyes. "Really, Mr. Potter?" came the voice of Professor McGonagall from behind him. "Ah," said Harry, surprised before he could internally recover. "Such dulcet and melodious tones are truly music to my unworthy ears. It must be an angel, come to give me her blessings." He turned around to see Professor McGonagall standing over near the head table. She stood there, trying hard not to smirk back. It wasn't helping her that Cygnus was head down on the Ravenclaw table guffering and slapping the tabletop, or that Sirius had fallen backwards off the bench and was rolling on his back on the floor laughing his butt off. "Professor McGonagall," Harry cheekily exclaimed in a chipper voice, "what an absolute joy it is to see you. My day keeps getting better and better." Without even saying a word, the oft-stern Transfigurations professor hesitated for the barest of moments before she spun about and hurried out of the hall via the teacher's entrance. He also hadn't noticed that Daphne had entered the hall and come up the side of the table to look down at a giggling Sirius lying on the floor. "Really, Lord Black," she expostulated, "is this the behavior we should come to expect from the lord of an ancient house?" And looked over at her father, who had hiccups and tears in his eyes from laughing too much. "Darling," said Harry, overly gaily, as he spun on hearing her voice. "Harry James Potter," she glared at Harry, "what have you done to two of our lords?" Sirius had finally managed to regain control of himself, and was using the bench to try and regain his feet. "I have merely provided light and humorous entertainment, while others have engaged in jovial conversation and contemplative study," he brightly replied with a flourishing bow. That set the two men off a little again. "You broke them," she sternly said. "Nay, darling," replied Harry, "they are merely appreciative connoisseurs of fine humour and gaiety." Daphne just rolled her eyes and sighed. Gran smirked and said, "I think we best leave while we still can," before she stood and cast a quick cleaning charm to the back of Sirius's robes. The other adults rose as Harry came back around. He offered his elbow with a flourish and said, "May I have the honour of escorting my lady?" Daphne glared at him and asked, "What have you been drinking?" But she took his elbow as they began to head for the main doors. With a cheeky grin, he replied, "I have supped from the fountain of life only, dear heart. Verily, I find myself somewhat giddy in the joy of existence." "Verily?" asked Daphne, glancing over and cocking an eyebrow. "Only you would think a word like verily is still used in common parlance," says the lady who used the word parlance in a like manner, he retorted. From behind, Harry heard the adults snickering and chatting. After being sidelong apparated from outside the front gates of the castle to the apparition point in Diagon Alley, their little party made their way into Gringotts. Just inside the doors, they were greeted by a goblin who had hurried over. He bowed to Cygnus, Sirius and Harry before he said, "Lord Potter, Master Account-Keeper, Bloodfang is expecting you. Please follow me." He spun on the spot and marched off across the hall to the doors at the rear. Still escorting Daphne, he followed along as they were led down the back hallway to the doors, wherein he knew Bloodfang made his office. After being bid to enter, the party filed inside. Harry made the introductions before he and Daphne took seat in front with the adults seated behind, along the back wall. "Lord Potter," began Bloodfang, "I'm pleased you have decided to attend Gringotts with such haste." Your missive implied haste was needed, said Harry. Indeed, replied Bloodfang. The minister is not happy you have taken your mantle as lord. He has attempted to block you access by way of ministerial decree. He dares? Exclaimed Cygnus. He does, replied Bloodfang as he slid parchment work across his desk to Harry. My lord, I need you to sign these documents. Once they are signed, they will be magically filed, both here and at the ministry. Once that is done, the minister's current efforts to have you stripped of your lordship will be circumvented. Dewey came forward and read the documents over Harry's shoulder. Bloodfang also placed before Harry a blood quill ready to sign each document. As Dewey finished each, he tapped it and said to Harry, "Sign it," which Harry did. As he signed the last document and they were slid back to Bloodfang, Harry asked, "You said the minister's current efforts. Do you anticipate others?" "Yes," replied Bloodfang. "Our informants within the ministry believe he is attempting to have your lordship overturned by having you stripped of your emancipation." He then hesitated a few moments before he said, "However, there is one sure way that it cannot happen." Harry stared at Bloodfang and frowned. "You're being reticent in telling me how, my friend. That is quite unlike you." Bloodfang placed the seal of Gringotts on each document before tapping the seal and causing the document to vanish with a flash of magic. Once he was done, Bloodfang looked back at Harry and said, "The betrothal contract between yourself and Lady Daphne," he gestured to her, "states that you are to marry once you come of age. It does not, however, state Lady Daphne must also be of age." Harry gasped in surprise. Daphne suddenly gripped Harry's left hand very tightly while he was madly reading the contract in his mind. After a few moments he sighed and said, "Damn, no, it doesn't." Turning to Daphne, he said, "I'm so sorry. I did not consider the impact my becoming emancipated would have on our betrothal contract." Cygnus cleared his throat and said, "Harry, this was somewhat anticipated. As you are a little over a month younger than Daphne, it was always expected she would be of age before you. As such, we never considered the possibility of you being emancipated at such an early age. However, we also knew this might be a possibility if Dewey's other efforts to have you removed from the tournament failed." Harry nodded and looked back at Bloodfang. "How would our being married circumvent the minister?" "A marriage ceremony undergone with the blessing of magic cannot be undone without the blessing of magic," replied Bloodfang. "Once you are married, the ministry cannot strip you of your emancipation, even if you wanted to be." "It seems like using a war axe to cut kindling to me," sighed Harry. He turned to the adults and said, "Now that those documents are signed and filed, it's going to take time for the minister to shift his focus. I'd rather call the minister out for attempting to interfere in the practices of an ancient house than be forced to marry so soon when we're both not ready for that commitment." Cygnus nodded and said, "I'll speak directly with the chief witch, Griselda Marchbanks, and demand an emergency session of the Wizengamot." "I'll second it," interrupted Sirius. "Thank you," said Cygnus, with a nod towards Sirius. "We'll need a Wizengamot-led investigation into the actions of the minister. If necessary, a vote of no confidence in him will also need to be filed. While it might not work, it'll hamstring him in taking any further pro-action until it's resolved. If I've already taken my seat in the Wizengamot, that will put paid to his shenanigans as well," said Harry. Cygnus sat thinking for a little while and said, "The last time anyone was allowed to take their seat in an emergency session of the Wizengamot was during the last war. And even then, the emergency session was for the purpose of allowing that to happen." "There's no reason an emergency session has to be for only one item," said Harry. "It could be to allow me to take my seat and to start an investigation into the actions of the minister." "Good point," mused Cygnus. He turned to Gran and asked, "Augusta? Your current regent for House Potter. Well, you would be proxy now. How do you feel about this?" Gran nodded and said, "Let's get Harry inducted onto the Wizengamot. He can then, if he wishes, retain me as proxy. I think Griselda will call the emergency session once we explain to her what Cornelius is up to. She's never liked the idea of the ministry interfering with the business of the ancient houses." Harry turned to Daphne and said, "Daphne, please don't think I'm trying to find a way out of marrying you. I'm not. I'm trying to find a way out of marrying you right now, because I have to. I want you to have the big, lavish wedding you and your mum have probably dreamed about, and being forced into it right now will deny you that." Daphne smiled back and said, "I know, but thank you for being considerate enough. Think of my feelings in this." Harry smiled back before turning to Bloodfang. "My friend, I'm going to need the documentation for me to take my seat on the Wizenga moat, and then hand my proxy off to Madame Longbottom. We'll be holding off on the marriage ceremony for now, but have the parchment work ready just in case." Bloodfang nodded and got to work by drawing out a couple of sheets of parchment and his quill. Harry turned back to the adults and asked Dewey, "Dewey, you've been awful quiet. Do you think the emergency session is the way to go forward?" He nodded and said, "I do." "All right," said Cygnus. "We have a plan of action plus a fallback if it's needed. Once Bloodfang's finished the parchment work, we need to head directly to speak with Madame Marchbanks. We have a fair bit to do and not a lot of time to do it before the minister tries something else." "But why is the minister so determined to stop Harry taking up his lordship?" asked Isabel. "He's not," replied Cygnus. "It'll be Malfoy and his ilk. I dare say they've had this ready to go since Dewey and I first applied for Harry to be emancipated a few weeks ago. Fudge wouldn't have done anything unless Malfoy told him to." From the bank, the party, except for Dewey, headed directly to the ministry. Dewey headed back to his own offices. They found Madame Marchbanks in the Chief Witch's office, the place she would often be found since the ouster of Dumbledore, and where he was rarely found. Entering the outer office, Cygnus approached the young secretary and asked, "Could you please inform the Chief Witch that Lords Greengrass, Black and Potter, and Lady Greengrass and Dowager Lady Longbottom would like a word?" The young witch looked up with a bit of awe before she hurriedly rose from her desk and said, "One moment, my lords and ladies." She dashed to the door of the Chief Witch, knocked quickly and ducked inside. A few moments later, she came out and held the door open. "Madame Marchbanks will see you now," she said. The party entered the office to Madame Marchbanks, struggling to rise from behind her desk. "Sit down, please, Griselda," said Cygnus. "None of us expect you to rise for us, you know that." With a nod, the old witch retook her seat and drew it back into her desk. With a light cough, she asked, "Cygnus, I take it this is an urgent matter?" Sirius conjured more seating across from the Chief Witch, and the party took seats. "Yes, Griselda, it is," replied Cygnus, sitting down. "Fudge has just attempted to strip a new lord of his emancipation within mere hours of him accepting it, and is attempting to stop the boy from taking his rightful seat." Madame Marchbanks frowned and said, "That's a pretty damning allegation. Perhaps you should start at the beginning and let me see if I can determine what is going on." Cygnus then ran through the events of the day and what they had discovered when they visited Gringotts. As he talked, she questioned, and Harry realized that though she was of great age, she was still a very sharp lady. It added to the high esteem he held of her from the trials. When Cygnus finished, the Chief Witch turned to Harry and asked, "I take it is your intention to retain your lordship and take seat on the Wizengamot?" "To retain my lordship and hand my proxy over to Madame Longbottom," he easily replied. "I find myself quite offended the minister is attempting to deny me my rightful seat before he has even met me to make such a decision." "Indeed," she said, "such actions offend me too." She leaned back in her chair and said to Cygnus, "Under my authority, I'll call the emergency session for tomorrow evening. I agree, it appears necessary young Lord Potter should be inducted into the Wizengamot with all due haste. And I further agree the Wizengamot needs, through its own authority, to investigate the minister in his actions. However, I won't allow the investigation to be, if you'll pardon the pun, a witch hunt. The investigation will be specific in finding out why the minister is trying to block Mr. Potter's elevation, that is all. We'll also put in place an embargo on the minister and the ministry taking any such action until the investigation is complete." "That's all we ask, Griselda," said Cygnus. "Thank you." After the meeting and back out in the atrium, Harry said, "Nice lady." Cygnus said, "She is. One of the few within the ministry I'm confident to say is completely incorruptible. She can also be utterly ruthless when she wants to be." Escorted by Sirius, Harry and Daphne flew back to Diagon Alley so Harry could be fitted with Wizengamot robes at Madame Malkin's. As they needed to be customized with the Potter House crest, he promised he would return early the next evening to pick them up before flooding to the ministry. Afterwards, he, Daphne and Sirius flew to Hogsmeade and walked to the gates of the castle. Sirius bid them a safe walk back and headed back to the ministry to meet up with Cygnus, Isabel and Gran. The Greengrasses and Madame Longbottom stayed at the ministry. They claimed other business to which they needed to attend. Harry suspected they would be questioning their own contacts to see if they could discover just why they were attempting to deny Harry his emancipation and lordship. Harry and Daphne had returned late afternoon and headed to their dorms to get changed out of their spiffy robes back into school robes. They met up, again, in the come-and-go room. The first to see Harry walk in, Neville asked, "How'd it go?" Harry explained what he, Daphne, and the adults discovered, and what he and the others then did to block the attempted circumvention. "So I'm going to have to get spiffed up again tomorrow, early evening, and head to the Wizardgamot chambers. Sirius will be waiting for me outside the gates to escort me," he said. He hadn't heard Daphne walk in and didn't know she was there until she said, "He'll be escorting us, Harry. I intend to be there to see you inducted." Harry turned and smiled. "You don't have to, you know," he said. "I want to," she said, walking around the lounges and sofa to take a seat at her and his normal seat. Harry joined her and softly said, "Thank you, I'd like that." She smiled and kissed him on the cheek. Turning to the others, she said, "Anyway, homework from today?" Hermione handed over what she'd written down for herbology to Harry and Dada to Daphne, and they were quickly working on long assignments. Harry received his potions assignment from Susan and an explanation of the potion they made. The next evening, Harry waited in the entrance hall for Daphne, and together they walked to the front gate. Sirius waited just beyond. A quick flew to Diagon Alley, and Harry was in Madame Malkin's to collect his robes. Sirius told him to wait on wearing them until he was in the antechamber of the Wizengamot to don them. He showed his own robes in a package in his pocket. After arriving at the ministry and passing through the checkpoint, Sirius escorted them down to the chamber on the 10th floor. Daphne was escorted into the VIP guest section of the visitors' gallery, and Sirius took Harry through to the waiting area. Harry quickly donned his new robes and was shortly joined by Cygnus, Gran, and Aunt Amelia. Cygnus said, "Isabel's sitting with Daphne. Now that you're ready, we're taking you through to the House Potter meeting room behind the tiers. It's blood-warded, so you're going to need to press your thumb on the impression. It will take a small blood sample to open the door." Harry followed Cygnus and Sirius through another door into a passageway that curved around behind where he knew the Wizengamot tiers were found. He passed a number of doors before Cygnus stopped at one that bore the Potter House crest on the door. Above the handle was the indentation for a thumb lock. He pressed his left thumb to the indentation and suddenly felt like a thumbtack lightly stabbed him on the ball of his thumb. A moment later, there was a click as the sound of a lock disengaged. He took a breath and opened the door into a decent-sized room. Clearly wizard-spaced, as the doors either side of his own were too close for it to be otherwise. He stepped in and the others followed in behind. Looking around, he saw a small desk off to one side with a comfortable office chair. The couple of chairs on the other side showed for guests. There was also a group of 4 armchairs around a centered occasional table set up for discussions. On the far wall was a large fireplace. Turning to Cygnus, he asked, "Is the fireplace connected to the Flu network?" "No," replied Cygnus. "They used to be before the war. Now it's considered a security risk. They haven't been reconnected since." Harry nodded before he changed the subject. "What happens now?" he asked. "We 4 have to meet in the assembly room at the other end of the passageway," replied Cygnus. "You wait here until your Gran and I come and get you and escort you onto the floor of the chamber. There we will present you to the Wizengamot. Simply answer the questions asked of you, and you will shortly be told to take your seat. You can sit anywhere you like that isn't already occupied." Harry nodded and quietly said, "Thank you." Sirius reached out and placed his hand on Harry's shoulder. "Relax, Harry," he said. "It's just the way things are done. It'll only be a few minutes." Harry nodded again before both Gran and Aunt Amelia stepped forward to give him a hug, offering their own soothing words. After they left, Harry took to exploring the reasonably sized room. He sat at the desk and tested out the drawers. The top drawer on the either side also had blood locks. Opening them, he discovered there was little in them other than blank parchment. It wasn't until he looked at the blotter before him that he noticed an envelope tucked just under the edge of the blotter. Pulling it out, he saw it was addressed to Lord Harry James Potter. It was written in his father's spidery handwriting. He quickly opened the envelope and pulled out the small note within. "Dear Harry, congratulations on coming of age. If you are reading this, you are clearly about to assume your rightful place on the Wizengamot. It's a huge step. By now you've re-established the alliances, and I suspect it will be two of Cygnus, Frank, Arcturus, Benjamin, or their successors, who will escort you through to be inducted. When you walk onto the floor, remember to stand proud. You are a Potter of the noble and most ancient house of Potter. You are powerful. People respect you. Listen to the advice of your allies, but make your own decisions, and you will do fine." "Dad!" Harry smiled and refolded the letter. After sliding it back into the envelope, he pocketed it and thought about his father's words. He found them comforting, and wondered how many other letters from his father he would come across in future. Getting up from the desk, he walked over to a filing cabinet and again opened a bloodlock to peek within. This time, it was filled with manila folders in a Muggle style. Taking a couple of them back to the desk, he opened them and saw documents dating back to the late 1970s and early 1980. The latest were often intelligence on Death Eater movements and background information on ones that were known about. He thought, that may come in handy in future. He closed the folders back up and returned them to the filing cabinet, locking it once more. He then moved on to a tall cabinet. When he opened it, he saw it was filled with bottles of wizard and Muggle spirits, many of them only partially full. Set in the door were what looked like little potions phials, with pepper-up potion and calming draughts being prevalent. Of course, they were all beyond their use by date. He smiled, knowing why they were there. It explained how previous Lord Potters were always seen as being alert and calm when the chamber devolved into semi-controlled chaos. He had just closed the cabinet again when there was a knock on the door. Opening it, he was greeted by Cygnus and Gran. "Ready, Harry?" asked Cygnus. Harry smiled and nodded. "Let's do this," he replied. Both grinned back. As he was escorted back out the passageway through which he was originally led in, Cygnus quietly said, "Fudge was right, Ropeable, when he found out you were being inducted tonight. He's been doing everything he can to try and block it. However, it's been in vain. You will be inducted tonight." "However," said Gran, "you're going to have to hold off on handing me your proxy." He did manage to get the proxy handoff blocked, as that wasn't specifically on the docket for tonight. "That doesn't change things, other than you'll have to remain for the entire session instead of being allowed to leave early. Because it's an emergency session, it won't be long anyway," said Cygnus. "After your induction, we will immediately get to the Wizengamot investigation into Fudge. I do not see that taking too long." Then they were there at the doors leading out onto the floor. Hesitating a moment, Cygnus asked, "Ready to go?" Harry took a couple of deep breaths and nodded. He stood up proudly and pushed the door open, and strode out into the middle of the floor. Gran and Cygnus took up station on either side of him. The members watched him come with barely a murmur. After a couple of moments of hesitation, Madame Marchbanks asked in a clear voice, "Who presents this new lord before us for induction into the honoured ranks of the Wizengamot?" "I do, Chief Witch," replied Cygnus. "Lord Cygnus Greengrass of the noble and most ancient house of Greengrass." "And I do, Chief Witch," replied Gran. "Dowager Lady Augusta Longbottom, Regent Longbottom, and Regent Potter of the noble and most ancient house of Longbottom." "And who do you present?" asked the Chief Witch. "We present Lord Harry Potter of the noble and most ancient house of Potter, Chief Witch Marchbanks," replied Cygnus. "Is our young lord of age?" asked the Chief Witch. "He is not," snarled a rather portly little man. Under his purple Wizengamot robes, he wore a bottle-green pinstriped suit and scarlet tie. His rumpled grey hair looked to be parted down the middle and had a sparse moustache. Harry took one look at him and wondered how the hell he managed to be elected. Clearly there were no coloured photographs of the man. "He is," snapped Cygnus back in a loud and carrying voice. He was emancipated only yesterday, during the first event of the Triwizard Tournament being held at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. His emancipation was not approved, snapped the little man right back. Madame Marchbanks banged a gavel a couple of times and regained silence. She snapped at the little man, "You will remain silent, Minister Fudge." Once she knew she had it, she turned to a young man sitting at the end of the bottom row of tiers. "Mr. Fawcett, do the records show that Mr. Potter is emancipated?" The young man looked a bit fearfully at Fudge before he glanced back down at his records. He flipped through the pages of a book before he looked back at the Chief Witch and said, "Harry James Potter, born 31st of July 1980, aged 14, emancipated by official representative of the minister, Mr. Bartemius Crouch Sr., at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry on the 24th of November 1994 at 2:37 p.m. And recognized by magic 1 minute later." Fudge surged to his feet again and shouted, "Crouch was not authorized to make such a determination. He exceeded his authority. As such, the emancipation is void." Madame Marchbanks banged her gavel a few more times and turned to Fudge. "Sit down, Minister," she barked back. Fudge resumed his seat. "Clearly," she said, a smidge quieter, "you did not pay attention to the part where it said magic has recognized the emancipation. Whether or not you believe Mr. Crouch had the authority, magic recognized he did. As such, we have no choice but to accept Mr. Potter was emancipated at that time. Now be silent." Fudge fumed where he sat but didn't respond. Madame Marchbanks glared at Fudge for a few moments longer before she turned back to Harry and his escort. "As Chief Witch, I acknowledge Mr. Harry James Potter has been lawfully emancipated." When it looked like Fudge was going to open his mouth again, she glared at him and raised her gavel. The portly little man quietened down again, and Madame Marchbanks lowered her gavel back onto the bench before her. She turned back to Harry and asked, "Has Mr. Potter accepted his lordship?" "He has, Chief Witch," replied Cygnus firmly with a glare at Fudge. Fudge surged to his feet again. Anyway, he was clearly becoming desperate. "He's too young," he snarled. "He's not yet ready to be seated." Madame Marchbanks banged her gavel a few more times before she finally snapped out, "Minister Fudge." The man, who was publicly proving himself to be an idiot, finally regained his seat in a sulk. Madame Marchbanks let out an exasperated sigh and turned back to Harry and his two escorts. She looked at Madame Longbottom and asked, "Madame Longbottom, as regent for the noble and most ancient house of Potter, is it your opinion Lord Potter is ready to take his seat among us?" "It is, Chief Witch," stated Gran firmly. "Then that is all we need to know on that matter," she said with a sideways look at the minister. She then looked firmly at Harry and said, "Lord Potter, as you have been found to be of age, have accepted your lordship, and have been found to be ready to accept your seat by your regent. As Chief Witch, I welcome you into our ranks. Please come forward and take seat among us." The entire seated Wizengamot, with a few notable exceptions, rose and applauded Harry as Cygnus and Gran escorted him up into the tiers. He was guided into a seat between Cygnus and Sirius. Given the supposed nature of the houses of Greengrass and Black, that surprised a few members who didn't seem to know of Harry's relationship to the two men. That surprised Harry, seeing as his betrothal to Daphne and that Sirius was his godfather were well and truly public knowledge. Harry looked up and across to the visitors' gallery and saw Daphne and Isabel almost bouncing in their seats in happiness for him. He grinned back and gave a small nod. Some of the other members came around and offered their own congratulations to him. Both Cygnus and Sirius whispered to him about who each member was and to which house they belonged. Harry was gracious in his thanks to each. Once it appeared the congratulations had settled down, Madame Marchbanks banged her gavel a few times and called the meeting back to order. "The second item of business has been kept under wraps under my own authority as Chief Witch," she said. Harry was surprised to hear that. He didn't know they hadn't made it public. By formal request from the houses of Greengrass and Black, further supported by the houses of Longbottom and Bones, a motion has been made to enact a formal Wizengamot investigation into the office of the Minister of Magic. The members of the Wizengamot, including the minister himself, went bananas. There was shouting and accusations flying all over the place. Madame Marchbanks calmly took up her gavel again and started banging it. After the first 10 bangs with no change in the volume, she put the gavel aside and drew her wand. She caused a huge bang to be ejected by her wand that was near deafening. Finally, the members settled down. To continue, she said, into the office of the Minister of Magic, into his interference of the birthright practices of a noble and most ancient house, namely the House of Potter. After a short hesitation, she called, "Lord Greengrass, the floor is yours." Members are once again reminded they are to remain silent while Lord Greengrass speaks. Cygnus calmly stood and said, "Honoured members, tonight you were witnesses to the latest attempt by the minister in attempting to interfere in the succession rights of an ancient house. After an hour of to and fro, the investigation was approved by clear majority. Fudge tried to circumvent the investigation by immediately resigning. However, he failed to grasp that the investigation wasn't into Cornelius Fudge, but into the entire office of the Minister of Magic. Those involved in the investigation included Cygnus, Aunt Amelia as regent for the House of Bones, Madame Marchbanks herself, an Elpheus Doge, and 2 members Cygnus told Harry were imperious Death Eaters. Both Cygnus and Sirius were happy as the people involved would ensure the investigation would not be wasted. By the time the session was closed, Harry was almost asleep. Some members' droning manner of speaking was quite soporific. It was only rising and walking down to get changed that Harry was able to stop from nodding off. He went into the Potter office and stripped off his Wizengamot robe before changing back into his nice business-style acromantula robe. Leaving the Wizengamot robe hanging from a hook behind the door, he stepped out and made his way back to the main floor of the chamber, and met with Isabel, Sirius, and Daphne. Sirius looked at him and said, "Cygnus and your Aunt Amelia have headed straight for the minister's offices to seal them under the imprimatur of the Wizengamot before Fudge or any of his lackeys can get there to abscond with any evidence. As head of the DMLE, Amelia has placed 2 Auror guards directly outside the doors for the night. They're going to commence the investigation first thing in the morning." "That explains why I saw Lord Malfoy practically bolt out of the chambers while still wearing his Wizengamot robes," smirked Harry. "Maybe he was keen to get started on the investigation for himself." "Yes," smirked Sirius right back. "Maybe someone should have told him that Amelia had already sent a message via her Auror badge to her department, and 2 Urods were already stationed outside the minister's offices with orders not to let anyone in, including members of the Wizengamot, until 8:00 around tomorrow morning." Harry chuckled. As they were heading through the atrium quiet, due to the time of night, Harry was scanning around looking for threats. He noticed Sirius was doing the same. Harry said, "I wonder how long it's going to take the Wizengamot to figure out they've just given the head of the DMLE carte blanche to search through everything in the minister's offices." Sirius looked askance back and said, "The Wizengamot investigation is only into Fudge's interference in your house's business, Pup." "I know," said Harry, with a bit of a shrug. "However, if they find anything else that might be criminal in nature while they're searching for that, well, Aunt Amelia has no choice but to act as head of the DMLE and investigate, doesn't she? Just because she's not looking for anything else does not imply she's not going to find anything else, yes?" Sirius suddenly stopped and looked at Harry in shock. After a moment, his face slowly morphed into a wide, gleeful grin. "That's brilliant," he softly exclaimed. "That's bloody brilliant." Turning to Isabel, he asked, "Isabel, did you get that?" "I did," she smirked. "I'll let Cygnus know tonight. I don't know if he's already figured that out yet." Sirius just barked with laughter and led the way to the outbound fireplaces so their small party could flew through to the 3 broomsticks. Harry and Daphne returned to Hogwarts too late in the evening to meet their friends, so headed straight to their dormitories. It wasn't until the next morning they all met up again at the Hufflepuff table. Hermione leaned forward from where she was sitting opposite and asked, "What happened last night?" "Oh," said Harry, "I was elevated to my seat on the Wizengamot. Fudge tried to stop it but failed. Straight after that, the Wizengamot voted to run a Wizengamot-led investigation into the office of the Minister of Magic. Fudge then resigned before the vote could be taken. He clearly thought he could stop it by doing so, but he failed to grasp that the investigation isn't into him, it's into the office of the Minister of Magic. which is what one of the other members immediately pointed out. So his resignation was accepted on the spot, and the vote went ahead. It was comfortably passed. As soon as it was passed, Aunt Amelia used her Auror badge to send in 2 Aurors to immediately toss out anyone who was still inside the minister's offices, even at that time of night, then seal and guard the door until this morning when the investigation officially begins. The funny thing was watching Lucy Malfoy bolt out of the chambers as soon as the gavel fell to close the session, without even bothering to doff his Wizengamot robes first. I think he was trying to get to the minister's offices before anyone else could. The pity for him is that the auras were already in place well before he could have got there. Aunt Amelia isn't stupid. She anticipated what was going to happen and moved first. Unofficially, I think she already had her auras securing the office as soon as the Wizengamot session began, before the motion was even raised. When the mail arrived, Harry received his daily profit from Hedwig and handed her a couple of slices of bacon as a reward. He then received a letter from Isabel, who wrote she'd passed the message on to Cygnus, who laughed and was very happy. The headline of the profit made Harry laugh, but the story was troubling. The boy who cancelled the Triwizard tournament. Yesterday afternoon, the 4th so-called unwilling competitor in the Triwizard tournament used trickery to wheedle his way out of the tournament, causing it to be cancelled, writes Rita Skeeter, your special correspondent. In an argument across the stands surrounding the competitor's arena, the so-called 4th competitor used verbal chicanery to get the ministry representative to attempt to force through a change to the contract governing the tournament. It is feared this trickery will result in the ministry representative, Mr. Bartemius Crouch, losing his magic and, possibly, his very life. We hope this foul deed will be recognized by the Goblet of Fire for what it is, and the so-called 4th competitor is the one who will lose his magic. Mr. Crouch and the 3 headmasters of Hogwarts, Beauxbaton and Durmstrang, will now need to work long hours to rectify the situation and allow the honourable competitors to continue on their quest for glory. It makes one wonder just why the 4th competitor entered at all. Was he looking just to spoil it for everyone because the tournament would take the limelight off him? Further down, Harry saw a second article that was far more interesting. The boy who was elevated, the minister who resigned, last night in an emergency session of the Wizengamot, our most famous head of a noble and most ancient house, was elevated to his seat on the Wizengamot, writes Monty Wordsworth. Earlier in the day, in a shocking turn of events, this head's emancipation was accepted by the minister's personal representative to the Triwizard tournament, Mr. Bartemius Crouch. Immediately on emancipation, the young man accepted his lordship. This new lord, who we are not permitted to identify due to an unfair exclusive media arrangement with a competitor, was accepted among his new peers on the Wizengamot to applause by said peers. The young man in question was presented by Lord Cygnus Greengrass and Madame Augusta Longbottom. On no less than 3 separate occasions, Minister Fudge unsuccessfully attempted to block his elevation. Immediately after the new lord was seated, the second item of business was announced. Lord Greengrass successfully moved to hold a Wizengamot-led investigation into the office of the Minister of Magic regarding his attempts to stop the new lord from being elevated to the Wizengamot. Unsurprisingly, the minister resigned before the vote could be taken. However, the investigation wasn't into Mr. Fudge, but was, instead, into his office. As such, the debate continued until a successful resolution was reached. It appears the lords and ladies of the Wizengamot do not take kindly to the ministry attempting to interfere with their rights of succession. We look forward to the near future when this investigation is concluded, and they report their findings. Harry handed the paper to Daphne and indicated the 2 articles. After she read them, she grinned back. That's typical Skeeter, but I'm finding I like our Mr. Wordsworth more and more, she said. As am I, said Harry. I feel some remorse for arranging the exclusive media contract with Luna as it applies to our Mr. Wordsworth. If I could have allowed an exception for him, I would have. However, his editor, Barnaby Cuffer, would have corrupted it, as Mr. Wordsworth is essentially his employee. Cuffer would have simply used Mr. Wordsworth's byline for every article about you, said Daphne. I know, he replied, hence why I couldn't do it. Write him a letter apologizing to him, she said. one that lays out why you took out the exclusive contract. Harry thought about that for a few moments before he said, "You're right, I should, and I will." At an undisclosed location known as Riddle Manor, Pettigrew had to make himself scarce. His master was in a complete snit that his carefully laid plans to have Potter where he wanted him on the 24th of June had collapsed. He ranted and raved, and Pettigrew believed he would probably have been killed by his master if his master did not still desperately need him. His master had somewhat destroyed the room in which he stayed, and it was a while before he calmed. "Wormtail," Baby Riddle breezily shouted. "Wormtail, I need my potion." Baby Riddle could feel he was close to losing magical control of the infant he possessed. Only through use of the snake venom potion could he hold it. Pettigrew, knowing his master had calmed once more, quickly brought in the potion and assisted his master to drink it. Once he had imbibed the foul concoction, Baby Riddle said, "We need a new plan. It would be better to have that strategic mind of Lucius assisting us. But he cannot be trusted at the moment." "I know it was the plan for the Potter boy to be captured while he competed in the final task, Master," said Pettigrew. "However, just because he will no longer be competing, can he not still be captured at that time, while all others are focused on the final task?" Baby Riddle stared at Pettigrew for a few moments before he smirked. "Well, Wormtail, it appears you do have flashes of brilliance come upon you at odd moments." "I live to serve, Master," said Pettigrew, with his eyes turned down. "Of course you do," said Baby Riddle. "Leave me now, I need to think on what you've told me." Pettigrew bowed deeply and fled the room. The investigation into the affairs of the minister's office took a decidedly gleeful turn for House Potter and their allies, when a secret drawer was found in the minister's desk. Inside was a slim ledger that listed what they discovered to be bribes paid to the minister, and bribes the minister paid to some of his underlings. The last one was from Lucius Malfoy, as were many of the others, and the line item of the last one was for Fudge to block Harry's elevation to his seat on the Wizengamot. That explained Malfoy's sudden dash from the Wizengamot session the couple of nights previous. The little rotund fool had kept a ledger, not only of the bribes he'd accepted or paid, but also included the Ys as line items. Apparently Aunt Amelia had done a little jig right there in front of the now ex-minister's desk. The list of those arrested included Lucius Malfoy, Dolores Umbridge, Senior Undersecretary for the Minister, Pius Thickness, a senior Auror, bribed to keep quiet about something he found in Malfoy Manor during a search a couple years ago, Marjorie Edgecombe, head of the Flu Network Authority and mother of fifth-year Ravenclaw, Marietta Edgecombe, who monitored the Flu Network to track movements of certain people. Fudge wanted to know about, including Harry Potter and an Addison Yaxley, who bribed Fudge for Fudge to drop investigating his dealings with the Muggles. There were others. Quite a few of them, in fact. But Fudge, Malfoy and the Umbridge woman were all definitely going to Azkaban. Others were going to be heavily fined and dismissed from service within the ministry. But all that could not happen until they were given trials. "And how goes the search for a new minister?" Harry asked his godfather via his mirror that night. "The politicking and other maneuvering has commenced," replied Sirius. "I'm surprised you haven't been approached yet." "Who said I haven't?" asked Harry a little cheekily. "There's a couple of Slytherins and Ravenclaws here, who've already come asking who I think would make a good minister. One even alluded to someone of no consequence, as he's a former masked moron." "Do you have someone in mind?" asked Sirius. "Nope. Only who I don't want," he replied. "If they once wore a mask, they're out. If they work for the current ministry, except for Aunt Amelia or any of her top auras, they're out. Oh, except for Arthur Weasley. Him I like." "That's a little unfair," said Sirius. "You've only met a few who work for the ministry. Most of them are good people." "True," mused Harry. "I'll probably wait then until the prophet starts making their recommendations and cross them off the list. Then." Sirius laughed. "You need to take this seriously, Harry. It's an important job." "I am," Harry countered. "That's why I'll only cross them off if the prophet supports them. Anyone the prophet supports is probably someone who bribed them." He then sighed and said, "I'll talk to Daphne and you lot, and you can recommend who I should vote for. However, I will not be politicking for them. If they ask, they're off the list." Fair call, said Sirius. That evening, Luna approached him for the first of the 3 interviews for the year he'd promised her. She carried it out in their room with the others of the 8, plus the Weasley twins in attendance. Her interview style was, as expected, pretty relaxed. She asked all the right questions, which even surprised Daphne, and Harry answered them all honestly and efficiently. There were even a couple of questions aimed Daphne's way, but Luna told her not to answer them if she didn't want to, and she wouldn't include the fact she didn't want to in the piece. Luna asked about how he felt when his name came out of the goblet, how he felt about the other 3 contestants, who he felt would win, how his schoolmates were handling it all, how his close friends were handling it all, and how well he was doing in school. She also covered the exclusive media contract and why Harry had agreed to one with Lovegood Publishing. He was full of praise for the Quibbler in their honourable approach to reporting, and said he thought the Prophet to be dishonest by reporting unsubstantiated rumours and half-truths as the whole unvarnished truth. As such, he called the Prophet a written version of a neighbourhood gossip-monger that was only interested in sensationalism and whatever lies they could get away with so long as they continued to sell newspapers. Luna then went into the events of the Chamber of Secrets and ensured she took down quotes from Neville. Especially, she asked Daphne, Tracy, and Hermione about their experiences being petrified, how Harry and the others felt about what was going on, and about the substandard teaching of fluff art. She lightly brushed over the betrothal and how both he and Daphne were coping with it, and even mentioned how close the 2 of them were. Of course, said Daphne, Harry and I will be married this summer, so— What? Squeaked Harry. We're getting married this summer, remember? She asked. It's in the contract. We are to be married the summer after you become of age or are emancipated sooner. Gah! Spluttered Harry. He quickly read through the contract in his mind and found the relevant clause. Harry asked Daphne. Oh my God, he exclaimed. I didn't realize. Oh my God, Daphne. Harry, said Daphne, growing quite concerned. When I became emancipated, said Harry, still in a bit of shock. I didn't think about that specific clause in the contract. It just said we are to marry after I became of age, not when. I thought we could put it off until after we both graduated. Oh my God. Daphne started giggling. Oh my God, he exclaimed again. Harry, she tried to soothe him while giggling. We, that is, my parents and I, did remember the clause in the contract. It just wasn't in the part about emancipation. We knew that if you had to use the emancipation trick to get out of the Goblet of Fire contract, we would have to marry this summer. But I didn't, exclaimed Harry. That's one of the foibles of an eidetic memory. While I remember everything, I cannot think of everything at the same time. I hadn't thought to check my memories of the betrothal contract to see that particular clause about emancipation. Well, darling, said Daphne, you and I will be starting our 5th year as husband and wife, Lord and Lady Potter. Oh my God, he exclaimed again. Daphne giggled some more before turning to Luna. I will ask you not include any of that in the article, Luna. Luna simply smiled and said, I haven't even been writing any of it down, so I agree. It's off the record, so to speak. After Harry had managed to calm himself down again, Luna continued. Ending the interview, Luna touched a little on Harry's home life before he returned to the wizarding world and how he was now coping some 3.5 years after leaving Privet Drive behind for good. When the interview finished, Harry was surprised by how much he divulged. Luna just made him so relaxed he just talked without considering the consequences. However, it was Luna's job to interview him and she did an admirable job of it. So he couldn't fault her for getting so much out of him. A couple of days later, Harry learned via Owl from Cygnus that Crouch had collapsed and was taken to St. Mungo's Hospital. It was believed he had collapsed from stress due to overwork. He was currently being kept in a private room. Harry wondered, however, if Crouch was actually losing his magic. Dewey assured him the Goblet of Fire would only strip him of his magic if it was Crouch's intent to breach the contract. As everyone knew it wasn't, they didn't think it would happen. In Hogwarts, Harry also learned that the 3 real champions had each signed a new magical contract, one with signatures on parchment, to continue with the Triwizard Tournament. However, it didn't all go the Ministry's way, as the Ministry clearly expected it to. The three brought in Dewey and had him negotiate the contract on their behalf. The contract was essentially the same. This time it had the proper dates included. It was also specifically written to include a competitor could withdraw at any time due to injury from either of the two remaining events without being in breach. And the contract did not include the competitor was required to attend any other event bar the two remaining challenges. When he approached Cedric about the rumors, Harry was informed the three champions were happy with the contract and wanted the event to go ahead. The added clauses in the contract also provided them relief against having their magic stripped if they could not compete when the remaining two events were to be held. The Ministry was not happy to learn the champions could not be forced to attend the Yule Ball, as it was not considered an event of the Triwizard Tournament, even though it was considered traditional. However, all three planned to attend anyway. They merely wanted the clause included in case some unforeseen emergency arose that meant they could not. The other item the representatives of the Ministry tried to force through was an attempt to strip the competitors of their exclusive media contracts. Dewey resoundingly stymied that by stating the contracts could not be stripped, even if the competitors wanted them to be. The contracts were ironclad, and any clause in the new contract would automatically be void due to the pre-existing contract, so it was pointless to include them. A few more days later, and the issue of the Quibbler with Harry's interview was published. Harry was quick to read it and gave Luna a big hug in congratulations for such an excellent piece of journalism. "You do wonderful work, dear Luna," said Harry with a big smile. "You clearly have a future in that field. Even if you don't choose to go into a career in journalism, I hope you consider a career as a writer." "That is my intent, Harry," she replied with a wide, beaming smile. A few others in the Great Hall that morning also had copies of the Quibbler. There were a few Ravenclaws who had initially subscribed only to tease the girl about it, but had kept their subscriptions after Harry had made her a protectee of House Potter. They were looking at the girl with surprise. Of course, the first and second years were not at school when everything came out over the Chamber of Secrets, and Harry's and Neville's involvement in it, and were now looking at both boys with not a little awe. It was the Monday evening after the first task when Dobby suddenly showed up in the come-and-go room with another house elf. This one looked female, as it was wearing what appeared to be a toddler girl's pink summer dress. It also appeared very drunk. "Dobby," asked Hermione, "why are you here?" "Dobby is sorry for not being at Mistress's home, Mistress Minnie," said the little elf. "Dobby's friend Winky is in need of help," he said, gesturing to the other elf. Almost unconsciously, Hermione muttered, "Hermione," while Dobby was speaking. "Besides looking like she's drunk, what's wrong with her?" "Winky was personal house elf of House Crouch," replied Dobby. "But her master gave her clothes because of something she didn't do." "Winky is a bad elf," the little elf wailed. Harry frowned and looked at the little elf as it blubbered. "Winky!" The little elf sniffled and looked at Harry. "Yes, Harry Potter, sir." "What is it you were supposed to have done for your old master to give you clothes?" he asked. "Winky is not being allowed to say," she blubbered, "it being house secret." "You were the elf who was accused of casting the dark mark at the Quidditch World Cup, weren't you?" asked Tracy. The little elf looked down and replied, "Master said Winky do it, but Winky did not." "That's impossible," huffed Hermione. "House elves cannot use wands." "What do you want us to do to fix this, Dobby?" asked Daphne. "Winky needs a new home, miss," he said almost hopefully. Harry looked at Hermione. She immediately said, "Oh no, my father still hasn't completely forgiven you for Dobby bonding with me." The others snickered. Thinking a moment, Harry then looked towards the twins, who were looking back from the potion station, where they were working on another prank potion. "What? Harrykins?" they asked. Daphne looked from Harry to the twins and back again, before she snorted in amusement. "Oh, that's just perfect," said Tracy, giggling. She'd figured it out too. The others got it very quickly after that, except the twins. Looking among themselves for a few moments, Harry turned and grinned at the twins and said, "Oh, boys, how would you like your own personal house elf?" The twins glanced at one another before they replied, "Merlin." "No, Mum would kill us." Thinking a moment, Harry said, "True, she would." He looked around and asked, "Luna?" Yes, Harry, she asked. You do not have a house elf, do you? He asked back. No, she replied. I do not know why not, but yes, I think House Lovegood can make use of her, if she sobers up and stays that way. It's up to you, dear Luna, said Harry. Luna thought it over and called Winky to stand before her. The hopeful little elf walked to stand in front of Luna. If I accept you on behalf of House Lovegood, will you stay sober and be a good elf? Asked Luna. Miss Luna wants Winky, asked the little elf. If you're willing to stay sober, then yes, replied Luna. Winky will do that, the little elf firmly replied. Harry quickly wrote out the oath to bind Winky to House Lovegood and handed it to Luna. She held her hand out and placed it on the elf's forehead and gave the oath. Winky gave her part of the oath, and there was the glow of binding taking place. Dobby let out another yahoo with a fist pump in the air as Winky was immediately sober. Luna smiled and looked down at the little elf and said, My daddy lives at home alone for most of the year since I started Hogwarts. Your primary job is to look after him and make sure he looks after himself. If he asks who you are, you can tell him, and you can tell him you're mainly my elf and my protector. Asked me to accept you. Yes, mistress, said the little elf. Thank you, mistress. She then popped away. Hermione turned to Dobby and said, You may go and help her settle in before returning to your normal duties. Thank you, Mistress Minnie, said Dobby, before he too popped away. It's Hermione, muttered the girl with an exasperated sigh to spot where the elf stood. Harry snickered. When she glared at him, he said, It's cute. He tries, really, he does. I know, she grumbled back with a pained expression. And how are your parents holding up with Dobby? Asked Daphne. Hermione brightened up and replied, Oh, he and Daddy are best mates now. Last summer, Daddy said he wanted to go hunting for red grouse and wished he could take Dobby with him to act as a game chaser. Dobby asked what a game chaser was, and he said the next moment Dobby looked like a beagle. He looked identical to the game chaser dog Daddy's friend, who often went with him, looked like. Daddy then recommended a few changes of colouring so Dobby didn't look like the same dog, and he said Dobby was ready. Then, the next Sunday, Dobby elf apparated them both up here to Scotland, and Daddy was able to bag 3 with Dobby chasing the grouse into the air. What? Asked Daphne. Do you mean to tell me house elves are animaguses? Oh no, replied Hermione, with a grin. It was a simple glamour. Dobby cast a glamour on himself to make people think he was a beagle. He even cast a sound-based glamour that made it seem like he was baying when he was yelling. The pureblood among them were gobsmacked. Hannah was the first to speak. I think I speak for the rest of us when I tell you we had no idea house elves could do that. No, it wasn't in that book that Uncle Cygnus gave me either, replied Hermione, but Daddy didn't know that. He thought it was normal for house elves to do it. Harry laughed. Typical, he said. There's an old Muggle saying, if you want something impossible done, give it to someone who doesn't know it's impossible to do. It will then be done. Anything else he can do we didn't know elves could do? Asked Hannah. Well, he can use the same sort of glamour magic to look like a nondescript person when he's working outside, she said. That's how he can get the outside work done in a Muggle neighborhood. Our neighbors think my parents have contracted a handyman gardener to do the work for them. That's wow, said Susan in wonder. I don't think my aunt knows they can do that. I don't think anyone in the wizarding world knows they can do that, said Daphne. In my defense for not telling you earlier, said Hermione, I thought everyone actually did. Things were settling down again after the furor over Harry's withdrawal from the tournament, and the 8 were looking forward to the ball even though they were not supposed to know about it yet. However, that sort of information does not remain secret for long. When it was publicly announced, there were very few who did not already know of it, but the 3rd years and down were quite disappointed to learn they could not attend unless someone 4th year and up asked them along as their date. Neville, ever the gentleman, immediately turned to Luna and asked her to be his date to the ball, which meant the 8 could attend, together as they wanted to. Once it was publicly announced, Cygnus and Isabel began to visit the castle each Saturday as private tutors in dance. Originally, they were only there to teach the 8. However, Many other students learned of the private tutoring and approached Harry begging to be allowed to be taught. The lessons were held each Saturday in the Great Hall and were open to fourth years and up, plus any younger years who were identified as dates of the older years for the ball. They were also quickly joined by Professors McGonagall and Sprout and Sirius in teaching. Little Professor Flitwick happily looked after the music requirements. For their part, Harry and Daphne both decided to keep their knowledge of other dances a secret. If the opportunity presented itself on the night for other forms of dancing, then they would hit the floor and dance that form. A plain old waltz was nice for a while, but it would quickly get boring. The other events of note were that Professor Snape had, again, backed off on his sneering and taunting of Harry. He even, though reluctantly, handed Harry points in potions. Harry was always only amused by the professor's actions, especially as the potions master never failed to take notes of Harry's minor modifications of the order in which to prepare said potions, when a clear improvement was made. The second other events of note related to Professor Moody. After Harry managed to get himself out of the Triwizard Tournament, the professor had taken to watching Harry very carefully. On a couple of occasions he had to use his invisibility cloak and make judicious use of the secret passages within the castle to avoid the man to get to the come-and-go room. It was on one of his jaunts, where the professor continually seemed to be able to track him, that led Harry to find out how to test for tracking charms. In the library, he discovered a book that showed how to check for them. It wasn't one type of spell either. It seemed various spells were required to show up any and all. It was while in the library he tested everything he had on him, and even himself. He found 5 different ones. There was 1 on the outside of his cloak, 2 on his book bag, and 2 on his shoes. The 1 on his cloak and 1 each on his book bag and shoes all seemed to have been done by the same person. The other person was responsible for the other 2. It took him a while to get the incantations right, but he was finally able to remove all 5, or rather, he was able to transfer them. The 2 done by the second person he transferred to Ron Weasley. The person responsible for the other 3 had his or her tracking charms moved to Draco Malfoy. The other thing he learned went hand in glove with testing for and moving tracking charms, actually casting them yourself. And of course he was a quick study. Once the tracking charms had been moved, he taught the others how to cast them, and allowed Daphne to cast a couple of them on him. 1 was on his personal self, while other went on his wand. Coy. "Why my wand?" he asked her. "Because you always have your wand with you," she smiled back. "Don't tell me you didn't understand that." Sheepishly he smiled and said, "It actually hadn't occurred to me." After that, Professor Moody seemed to continually try and follow Mr. Weasley the youngest about the place, and was confused whenever he came across Ron and not Harry. That at least gave Harry the identity of one of his taggers. But it didn't explain why. After that, each time he left the Dada class he would check for new tracking charms. Each time he found one he'd move it to another student. It would be a different student each time. Harry had also tested to see if he could cast, or transfer to, a tracking charm on a ghost. He could not. However, he was once able to successfully transfer the charm to Peeves, the poltergeist. He also told Peeves what he had done and why. Peeves thought it hilarious and led the professor on a merry chase throughout the castle for about 4 days. Harry gave as good as he got. Now that he knew of the tracking charms, which were first invented to keep tabs on small children with a sense of adventure and wanderlust, Harry had taken to casting similar charms on Professor Moody. He'd cast them on the man's wooden leg, on his wand, on his cane, on his great coat, and once even on his magical eye. The last one gave the 8 no end of amusement. By then, Harry thought both knew the other knew what they were doing. However, neither seemed to be inclined to stop. Though he didn't know why Moody seemed hell-bent on continuing their little game, Harry was having far too much fun to end it. Many late afternoons were spent updating the group onto whom he'd transferred the latest tracking charms. It was the twins who'd suggested Peeves. Unknown to Harry, though, Moody had no idea it was Harry and his friends who were the ones transferring his trackers or putting them on him. He was positive it was a member of staff. After all, such charms were not taught to children. They were for adults to cast on children, not the other way around. The next afternoon, Harry was greeted by a clearly excited Hermione, Neville, and Tracy. "What's going on?" he asked. The three looked at one another for a few moments before Tracy said Professor Moody was arrested. "Today," she replied. "Only it wasn't Professor Moody." "Oh?" asked Harry, a little dumbfounded. "Nope," she replied with a huge grin. "Rumor has it was some Death Eater using polyjuice to make himself look like Moody, and that Moody was trapped inside a trunk in his office. He's the real Moody, that is supposed to be up in the infirmary right now." Harry was shocked. Hermione said, "Apparently Dumbledore finally figured it out. He compared the writing style of the hidden school on the bottom of the parchment that had your name on it with the writing style of the staff. It matched fake Professor Moody's handwriting off a document the fake professor had to submit relating to the end-of-term progress reports of the students. He and Professor McGonagall had a fight with him this afternoon before Professor Dumbledore subdued him and tied him up. The Auras came by later and took away the polyjuiced man once the potion wore off." "Any idea who it really was then?" asked Harry. "None," said Tracy, "but we'll learn soon enough through the Daily Prophet when the information is released." Harry snorted and said, "The Prophet could tell me it was the minister himself and I wouldn't believe them." On the Saturday before Christmas, the day after the last day of school term and a special Hogsmeade visit day, Harry had to attend his first proper Wizengamot session. The previous 3 weeks had been horrendous, politically speaking. The battle for the next Minister for Magic eventually cut down to 3 finalists. They were Rufus Scrimgeour, the current head of the Auror Office under Aunt Amelia, Lord Tiberius Ogden, and Dirk Creswell, head of the Goblin Liaison Office. When Harry asked his ex-guardians who was the best choice, his choice wasn't made easier when they hemmed and hawed a fair bit before finally telling him to go with his gut feelings on the matter. Just before they entered the chamber from the assembly room in the Wizengamot's private chambers, Scrimgeour approached him and tried to secure his vote, which Harry didn't really mind as it was expected at that time. However, when Scrimgeour tried to impress on Harry that, as the boy who lived, he should use his fame to support him, Harry snapped back at the man. In a carrying voice, he said, "Mr. Scrimgeour, you've just lost my support. While you may think it's all right to use me and my unwanted fame to your own advantage, I assure you, sir, I most certainly do not. Anyone who would stoop to such tactics, in my opinion, would make a poor choice for minister," and stormed off. Cygnus and Sirius grabbed him and took him to one side. "Well, that's going to put the Kneazle in with the hens," said Cygnus with a chuckle. "Right up until you just shot him down, it looked like Scrimgeour had it in the bag." Harry frowned and crossed his arms across his chest. "Good. Hopefully, whoever does actually get the job will know not to try and use me like that." Once they were all called in and were seated, Chief Witch Marchbanks had called them to order. The session was commenced, and the first item of business was the election for the new minister. Dirk Creswell, the rank outsider, won it in a shock victory. The man, shocked himself, stood in his place, thanked those who voted for him, and said he didn't even have a speech prepared as he believed he wasn't going to win. He gave a few words about doing the best he could do in the role, promised to ensure those caught in the incidences of bribery would be both fairly treated and honestly tried, and sat down again. The rest of the session went on with normal Wizengamot business. Then, on its conclusion, Madam Marchbanks wished everyone a happy Yule season and would see them all again on the 3rd Saturday in January for the first session of the 1995 year.